It was a fine feast. No one could recall its equal, and Porterhouse is famous for its food. There was caviar and soup à l'oignon, turbot à champagne, swans stuffed with widgeon, and finally, in memory of the founder, beefsteak from an ox roasted whole in the great fireplace of the college hall. For 2 hours the silver dishes came, as the waiters scurried to and fro, bowed down by the weight of food and their sense of occasion. For 2 hours the members of Porterhouse were lost to the world, immersed in an ancient ritual that spanned the centuries. Outside the hall, the winter wind swept through the streets of Cambridge. Inside, all was warmth and conviviality. Along the tables, 100 candles cast elongated shadows across the portraits of past masters that lined the walls. Severe or genial, scholars or politicians, the portraits had one thing in common. They were all rubicund and plump. Only the new master differed from his predecessors. Seated at the high table, Sir Godber Evans picked at his swan with a delicate hesitancy that was in marked contrast to the frank enjoyment of the fellows. As he ate, he studied their faces with distaste. They were an atavistic lot, and never more so than now, with their napkins tucked into their collars, their foreheads greasy with perspiration, and their mouths interminably full. How little things had changed since his own days as an undergraduate in Porterhouse. Even the college servants were the same, or so it seemed. The same shuffling gait, the adenoidal open mouths and tremulous lower lips, the same servility that had so offended his sense of social justice as a young man, and still offended it. For 40 years in politics, Sir Godber had marched beneath the banner of social justice, or at least paraded. And if he had achieved anything, it was due to the fine sensibility that had been developed by the social chasm that yawned between the college servants and the young gentlemen of Porterhouse. It was perhaps this knowledge that had led him to the decision to end his career as an initiator of social change by a real alteration in the social character and traditions of his old college. That and the awareness that his appointment had met with the adamant opposition of almost all the fellows. Only the chaplain had welcomed him, and that was in all likelihood due to his deafness and a mistaken apprehension of Sir Godber's full name. Porterhouse itself has no equal amongst Cambridge colleges in its adherence to old traditions. And yet it's not rich, for unlike nearly all the other colleges, it has few assets to fall back on. Its annual income amounts to less than £50,000 per annum, and to this impecuniosity it owes its enduring reputation as the most socially exclusive college in Cambridge. If Porterhouse is poor, its undergraduates are rich. Where other colleges seek academic excellence in their freshmen, Porterhouse more democratically ignores the inequalities of intellect and concentrates upon the evidence of wealth. True, a few scholarships and exhibitions exist which must be filled by men whose talents do not run to financial means, but those who last soon acquire the hallmarks of a Porterhouse man. To the master, the memory of his own days as an undergraduate still had the power to send a shudder through him. A scholar in his day, he had come to Porterhouse from a grammar school. The experience had affected him profoundly. From his arrival had dated the sense of social inferiority which, more than natural gifts, had been the driving force of his ambition, and which had spurred him on through failures that would have daunted a more talented man. After Porterhouse, he would remind himself on these occasions, a man has nothing left to fear. Looking down the hall at the faces florid in the candlelight and listening to the loud assertions that passed for conversation, he was strengthened in his resolve to change, once and for all, the character of the college. In the musicians' gallery, the head porter, Scullion, sat surveying the feast with an air of critical propriety. There was no envy in his eyes, only approval at the fitness of the arrangements. It was all as it should be, as it had been since Scullion first came to the college as an under-porter some 45 years before. In the darkness, he smiled at his memories of his youth, all different now. The young gentlemen weren't the same. The spirit had gone out of them since the war. They'd got grants now. They worked. Who'd ever heard of a Porterhouse man working in the old days? They were too busy drinking and racing. Gentlemen they were. No-nonsense, damn-a-souled gentlemen. Presently the chef climbed the stairs from the kitchen and took his seat next to Scullion. "Ah, chefy, a fine feast. As good as any I can remember," Scullion told him. "And better than they deserve." "Someone has to keep the old traditions, Mr. Scullion," said the chef. "True, very true," Scullion nodded. They sat in silence, watching the waiters clearing the dishes and the port moving richly round. "And what is your opinion of the new master, Mr. Scullion?" Scullion raised his eyes to the painted timbers of the ceiling and shook his head sadly. "Not a gentleman." "Ah, not a gentleman, eh? And him with a knighthood, too." "Gentlemen don't depend on knighthood, chefy. Gentleman is gentleman," Scullion told him, and the chef, suitably rebuked, nodded. Mr. Scullion wasn't somebody you argued with. Not about matters of social etiquette. Not in Porterhouse. Not if you knew what was good for you. The head porter was a power in the college. "Still, it was a fine feast. I can't remember it better," and was about to go downstairs when the master rapped on the high table for silence and stood up. In the musicians' gallery, Scullion and the chef stared in horror at the spectacle. A speech at the feast? No, never! The precedents of 532 feasts forbade it. Sir Godber stared down at the heads turned towards him so incredulously. He was satisfied. The stunned silence, the stares of disbelief, the tension were what he wanted, and not a single snigger. Sir Godber smiled. "Fellows of Porterhouse, members of college," he began with the practised urbanity of a politician, "as your new master, I feel that this is a suitable occasion to put before you some new thoughts about the role of institutions such as this in the modern world." Calculated. Every insult delicately calculated. Porterhouse, an institution, new, modern role. The words, the clichés defiled the atmosphere. Sir Godber smiled. His sense of grievance was striking home. "After such a meal, it is surely not inappropriate to consider the future and the changes that must be made if we are to play our part in the contemporary world." The platitudes rolled out effortlessly, meaninglessly, but with effect. And awed by the spectacle, Porterhouse sat in silence. "And so let me end with this promise," Sir Godber wound up his appalling peroration. "Porterhouse will expand. Porterhouse will become what it once was, a house of learning. Porterhouse will change." He stopped, and for the last time smiled, and then, before the tension broke, turned on his heel and swept out into the combination room and on to the master's lodge. Behind him, with a sudden expiration of breath, the feast broke up. As the hall emptied, and even as the fellows drifted through the door of the combination room, the chaplain rose to say grace. Deaf to the world and the blasphemies of Sir Godber, the chaplain gave thanks. Only Scullion, standing alone in the musicians' gallery, heard him, and his face was dark with anger. In the combination room, the fellows digested the feast dyspeptically. But if they found difficulty in coming to terms with the contents of their stomachs, the contents of Sir Godber's speech were wholly indigestible.
"Outrageous," said the Dean. "One might have imagined he was addressing an electoral meeting."
"It was certainly a very inauspicious start," said the senior tutor. "One would have expected a greater regard for tradition. When all is said and done, we are an old college."
"All may have been said,"
snapped the Dean, who disliked the senior tutor,
"but it has certainly not been done. The master's infatuation with contemporary fashions of opinion may lead him to suppose that we are flattered by his presence. I, for one, am unimpressed.
Perhaps his bark is worse than his bite, said the bursar hopefully. Bite? Shouted the chaplain. But I've only just finished dinner, and promptly fell asleep.
I'm sure the master will allow himself to be guided by our advice, said the praelector.
Whatever else he may do, said the senior tutor, I, for one, am not prepared to sit back and allow him to alter our present admissions policy.
I don't see how we can afford to, the bursar agreed. We are not a rich college. The point will have to be made to him. We look to you, bursar, to see that he understands it.
The bursar nodded dutifully. His was not a strong constitution, and the dean overawed him.
And as far as the college council is concerned, I think the best policy will be one of, amiable inertia, the praelector suggested. That has always been one of our strong points. There's nothing like prevarication. I have yet to meet a liberal who can withstand the attrition of prolonged discussion of the inessentials.
The evening over, and the battle soon to begin, they went out into the court, their gowns wrapped around them against the cold. Like so many black puddings, they made their way to their rooms. Only the bursar lived out with his wife. Porterhouse was still a very old-fashioned college. In the porter's lodge, Scullion sat in front of the gas fire, polishing his shoes. A tin of black polish stood on the table beside him, and every few minutes he would dip the corner of his yellow duster into the tin and smear the polish onto the toe of his shoe with little circular movements. Then he would spit on the toe cap and rub it again with an even lighter touch before picking up a clean duster and polishing it until it shone like black Japan. Finally, he would hold the shoe away from him so that it caught the light and he could see deep in the brilliant polish a dark, distorted reflection of himself. And all the time Scullion's mind, protected by the ritual and the artifacts of habit, digested the import of the master's speech. Change. There was always change, and what good did it do? Scullion could think of nothing good in change. And above him the tower clock whirred and rumbled before striking 12. Scullion put on his shoes and went outside. Snow was now falling, and the court was white. He went to the postern gate and looked briefly outside, and then shut the door. The outside world was none of his affair. It had a bleakness that he didn't want to know. He went back into the porter's lodge and sat down again with his pipe. Around him the paraphernalia of his office. The old wooden clock, the counter, the rows of pigeonholes, and the keyboard were reassuring relics of his tenure and reminders that he was still needed. While the world changed, and not for the better, Porterhouse was still the same. Porterhouse and Scullion, relics of an old tradition. After a while, he got up and walked across the court, and down the Fellows' Garden to the back gate. Everywhere the snow had submerged the details of the garden. At the back gate he stood looking up at the rows of iron spikes that topped the wall. How often in the old days he had stood there in the shadow of the beech trees, watching the young gentlemen negotiate those spikes, only to step out and take their names. Now no one climbed in. Scullion didn't know why he bothered to come and look at the back wall any more. Out of habit. Old habit. He was just about to turn and trudge back to his bed in the lodge when a scuffling noise stopped him in his tracks. Someone in the street was trying to climb in. Zipser walked down Free School Lane past the black clunch walls of Corpus. The talk on population control in the Indian subcontinent had gone on longer than he had expected. He had not been sure which had been worse: the delivery, if that was an appropriate word to use about a speech that concerned itself with abortion, or the enthusiastic advocacy of vasectomy. The speaker, a woman doctor, had described vasectomy so seductively that Zipser had found himself crossing and recrossing his legs and wishing to hell that he hadn't come. Even now, as he walked back to Porterhouse through the snow-covered streets, he was filled with foreboding and a tendency to waddle. Still, he had to get out of Porterhouse for the evening. As the only research graduate in the college, he found himself isolated. Below him, the undergraduates pursued a wild promiscuity which he envied but dare not emulate, and above him, the fellows found compensation for their impotence in gluttony. Besides, he was not a Porterhouse man, as the dean had pointed out when he'd been accepted. "You'll have to live in college and get the spirit of the place," he'd said. And while in other colleges research graduates lived in cheap and comfortable digs, Zipser found himself occupying a suite of rooms in Bull Tower, and forced to follow the regime of an undergraduate. For one thing, he'd had to be in by 12 or face the wrath of Scullion and the indelicate inquiries next morning of the dean. He shivered. The snow was falling heavily now, and at this hour it was clear that he wasn't going to wake Scullion. He would have to climb in. It was an undignified thing for a graduate to do, but there was no alternative. Above him, the iron spikes on top of the wall looked more threatening than ever. He found a bicycle and put it against the wall. Then he climbed up until he could grasp the spikes with his hands. He paused for a moment, and with a kick he was up with one knee on the wall and his foot under the spikes. He eased himself up and swung the other leg over, found a foothold and jumped. He landed softly in the flower bed, and was just moving off down the path under the beech trees when a hand fell on his shoulder. Zipser reacted instinctively. With a wild flurry, he struck out at his attacker. The next moment, a bowler hat was in mid-air, and Zipser himself was racing across the grass towards New Court. Behind him, on the gravel path, Scullion lay breathing heavily. Zipser glanced over his shoulder as he dashed through the gate into the court and saw the dark shape on the ground. Then he was at the entrance to the Bull Tower and climbing the stairs to his rooms. He shut the door and stood in the darkness, panting. It must have been Scullion. The bowler hat told him that. He had assaulted a college porter. He went to the window and peered out, and it was then that he realized what a fool he'd been. His footsteps in the snow would give him away. Scullion could follow them. But there was no sign of the porter. Perhaps he was still lying out there unconscious. Scullion got to his feet and picked up his bowler, brushed the snow off it and put it on. His right eye was swelling. "Getting too old for this job," he muttered, muddled feelings of anger and respect competing in his mind. He thought back to the days of his youth. "Yeah, fair's fair. If you can't catch 'em, you can't report 'em." Old Fuller, the head porter at Porterhouse, had said that to him when he first came to the college, and what was true then was true now. He turned left at the gate and onto the lodge and went through to his bedroom. "Ooh, a real shiner," he said, examining the swollen eye in the mirror behind the door. He could do with a bit of beefsteak. He took off his jacket and was unbuttoning his waistcoat when the door of the lodge opened. Scullion buttoned his waistcoat again, put on his jacket, and went out into the office. Zipser had watched Scullion cross to the lodge. Well, at least he wasn't lying out in the snow. Still, he had to do something. He'd better go down and see if he was all right. He walked across the court and into the lodge. It was empty, and he was about to turn away when Scullion appeared. His right eye was black and swollen, and his face, old and veined, had a deformed, lopsided look about it. "Well?" Scullion asked out of the side of his mouth. One eye peered angrily at Zipser. I just came to say I'm sorry about hitting you." "What makes you think you hit me?" The lopsided face glared at him. Zipser scratched his forehead. "You thought I was going to report you, didn't you?" "Well, I'm not." "He got away." Zipser shook his head. It wasn't that. I thought you might be, hurt." Scullion smiled grimly. "Hurt? Me? Hurt? What's a little hurt matter?" He turned and went back into the bedroom and shut the door. Through the still hours of the night, Sir Godber planned his campaign. In the first instance, he would order a thorough inventory of the college's resources and make the economies needed to finance the alterations he had in mind. In themselves, such economies would effect some changes in Porterhouse. The kitchen staff could well do with some thinning out, and since so much of the ethos of Porterhouse emanated from the kitchen, and the endowments lavished upon it by generations of Porterhouse men, a careful campaign of retrenchment there would do much to alter the character of the college. And such savings would be justified by the building programme and the expansion of numbers. But first he would need an ally. He ran through the fellows in search of a weak link, and in his mind alighted on the bursar. Here was the key. If the bursar, as the treasurer of the college, could be enlisted on the side of change, his assistance would be invaluable. Satisfied, the master turned on his side and fell asleep. At 7 he was woken by his wife, Lady Mary, whose insistence that early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, comfortably off, and wise had never ceased to irritate him.
"How did the feast go?" she asked.
"Tolerably, I suppose. We had swan stuffed with some sort of duck. Very indigestible. Kept me awake half the night."
"You should be more careful about what you eat. You don't want to have a stroke."
"It's called Porterhouse Blue."
What is?"
"A stroke."
"Oh, I thought it was something you got for rowing."
"Well, it isn't. It's an apoplectic fit brought on by overindulgence, an old college tradition, and one I intend to eradicate.
And about time, too. I think it's utterly disgraceful in this day and age that all this good food should go to waste just to satisfy the greed of some old men. When I think of all those—" Sir Godber went into the bathroom and shut the door. Dimly through the door he could hear his wife lamenting starving children in India. He looked at himself in the mirror and sighed. Just like the bloody cockcrow, he thought. Starts the day with a dirge. Wouldn't be happy if someone wasn't dying of starvation or dropping dead of typhus. The master shuddered and began to shave.
"Ah, bursar, so good of you to come," said the master, rising from his chair. "Some Madeira, or would you prefer something a little more contemporary? A Campari, for instance?"
"Oh, I think something contemporary would be fitting, master."
"So do I, bursar, so do I indeed," said the master, and poured the drinks. "Now then," he said when the bursar had seated himself in an armchair, "to business."
To business,"
said the bursar, raising his glass in the mistaken belief that a toast had been proposed. The master eyed him cautiously. "Yes, well, I've asked you here this morning to discuss the college finances. I believe that you and I share responsibility in this matter."
Quite right, master."
But of course, as bursar, you are the real power. I quite appreciate that. I have no desire to impinge upon your authority in these matters. Let me assure you of that. My purpose in asking you here this morning was to reassure you that the changes I spoke of last night were of a purely general nature. I seek no alterations in the administration of the college."
"Oh, quite," said the bursar, nodding with approval. "I entirely agree."
"So good of you to say so, bursar. I had the impression that my little Sally had a not altogether unmixed reception from the less, contemporary senior fellows."
"We are a very traditional college, master."
"Yes, so we are, but some of us, I suspect, are rather less traditional than others. Bursar?"
"Oh, I think it's fair to say so, master."
Like two elderly dogs, they circled warily in search of the odour of agreement, sniffing each hesitation for the nuance of complicity. It was an hour before the preliminary skirmishes were done, and with a second, larger Campari, Sir Godber relaxed the role of master. "It's the sheer animality of so many of our undergraduates I object to."
"We tend to attract the less sensitive, I must admit."
The bursar puffed his cigar contentedly. "Academically, our results are deplorable. When did we last get a first?"
1956. In geography."
The master got up and stood looking out of the French windows. "It is time to change all that. We must return to the founder's intentions, studiously to engage in learning. We must accept candidates who have good academic records instead of the herd of illiterates we seem to cater for at present."
There are one or two obstacles to that."
"Quite so. The senior tutor, for one. He is in charge of admissions."
I was thinking rather of our, how shall I say, dependence on the endowment subscriptions," said the bursar.
"The endowment subscriptions? I've never heard of them."
"Very few people have, master, except, of course, the parents of our less academic undergraduates." Sir Godber frowned and stared at the bursar.
"Do you mean to say that we accept candidates without academic qualifications if their parents subscribe to an endowment fund?"
"I'm afraid so. Frankly, the college could hardly continue without their contributions."
"But this is monstrous! Why, it's tantamount to selling degrees."
"Not tantamount, master. Identical."
Sir Godber sat down dumbfounded. "Good God! You mean to tell me that without these contributions, damn it, these bribes, the college couldn't carry on?"
In a nutshell, master, Porterhouse is broke. So, you see, while I support you in principle, I'm afraid the exigencies of our financial position do impose certain restraints in the way of effecting the changes you have in mind."
The bursar finished his Campari and stood up. The master sat staring out into the garden. It had started to snow again, but he was not aware of it. His mind was on other things. Looking back over his long career, he was suddenly conscious that the situation he was now facing was a familiar one. The bursar's arguments had been those of the Treasury and the Bank of England. Sir Godber's ideals had always founded on the rocks of financial necessity. This time it would be different. The frustrations of a lifetime had come to a head. Sir Godber had nothing left to lose. Porterhouse would change or bust. Sir Godber stood up and turned to the bursar. He was no longer there. He had tiptoed from the room and was waddling gently across the fellow's garden. Zipser overslept. His exertions, both mental and physical, had left him exhausted. By the time he woke, his bedder, Mrs. Biggs, was already busy in his outer room moving furniture and dusting. "Mr. Zipser, are you decent?" she called. "Oh, hang on, I'm coming," Zipser called back. "I shouldn't be at all surprised," Mrs. Biggs muttered audibly. Zipser eased himself out of his bed and began to dress, and opened the door. "I haven't got all day," Mrs. Biggs said, brushing past him provocatively. I'm sorry to have kept you," said Zipser sarcastically. "Kept me, indeed. Listen to who's talking, and what makes you think I'd mind being kept?" Zipser blushed. That's hardly what I meant." "Oh, Mr. Scullion's got a black eye this morning. A right perler. Not before time, either." She went into the other room, and Zipser followed her. He put a kettle on to make coffee while Mrs. Biggs bustled about, picking things up and putting them down again in a manner which suggested that a great deal of work was being done, but which merely helped to emphasize her feelings. All the time she rattled on with her daily dose of inconsequential information, while Zipser dodged about the room like a toreador trying to avoid a talkative bull. Each time she brushed past him, he was aware of an animal magnetism that overrode considerations of taste and that aesthetic sensibility his education was supposed to have given him. Finally, he stood in the corner, hardly able to contain himself, and watched her figure as it walloped about the room. Her words lost all meaning, became mere soothing sounds, waves of accompaniment to the surge of her thighs and the great rollers of her buttocks dimpled and shimmering beneath her skirt. "Well, I says, you know what you can do!" Mrs. Biggs' voice echoed Zipser's terrible thought. She bent over to plug in the vacuum cleaner, and her breasts plunged in her blouse and undulated with a force of attraction Zipser found almost irresistible. He felt himself move out of his corner like a boxer urged forward by unnatural passion for an enormous opponent. Words crowded into his mouth, unwanted, unspeakable words. "I want you," he said, and was saved the final embarrassment by the vacuum cleaner which roared into life. "What's that you said?" Mrs. Biggs shouted above the din. She was holding the suction pipe against a cushion on the armchair. Zipser turned purple. "Nothing!" he bawled and fell back into his corner. "Bag's full," said Mrs. Biggs and switched the machine off. In the silence that followed, Zipser leant against the wall, appalled at his terrible avowal. He was about to make a dash for the door when Mrs. Biggs bent over and undid the clips on the back of the vacuum cleaner. Zipser stared at the backs of her knees. The boots, the creases, the swell of her thighs, the edge of her stockings, the crescent. "You can't get any suction when the bag's full." She straightened up, holding the bag grey and swollen. Zipser shut his eyes. "Are you feeling all right, dearie?" she asked, peering at him with motherly concern. Zipser opened his eyes and stared into her face. "I'm all right," he managed to mutter, trying to take his eyes off her lips. "I didn't sleep well, that's all." "Too much work and not enough play makes Jack a dull boy. Now you just sit down and I'll make you some coffee and you'll feel better." Mrs. Biggs's hand grasped his arm and guided him to a chair. Zipser slumped into it and stared at the vacuum cleaner while Mrs. Biggs, bending once again and even more revealingly now that he was sitting down and closer to her, inserted a new bag into the back of the machine. He couldn't imagine what was happening to him. He had to get away. He couldn't go on sitting there while she was in the room. He'd do something terrible. He was about to get up and sneak out when Mrs. Biggs straightened up. "Oh, you do look funny," she said, putting a cup into his hand. "You ought to go and see a doctor. You might be going down with something. Do you often get taken queer?" "Queer?" said Zipser, shaken by the accusation. "Certainly not. I was only asking. I had a young man once, just like you. Got took queer every now and then. Used to throw himself about and wriggle something frightful. Took me all my time to hold him down, it did." Zipser stared at her frenziedly. The notion of being held down while wriggling by Mrs. Biggs was more than he could bear. With a sudden lurch, Zipser hurled himself out of the chair and dashed from the room. He rushed downstairs and out into the safety of the open air. "I've got to do something. I can't control myself. First Scullion and now Mrs. Biggs." The Dean spent the morning writing letters to members of the Porterhouse Society, his pen scrawling swiftly across the page. It would take more than Sir Godber Evans to change the character of Porterhouse, he'd see to that. He'd just finished a letter and was addressing the envelope when there was a knock on the door. "Yes, come in," the Dean called. The door opened and Scullion came in, holding his bowler hat in one hand. "Morning, sir." "Good morning, Scullion." The ritual of 20 years. The porter's daily report always began with pleasantries. "Heavy fall of snow during the night?" "Very heavy, sir. 3 inches at least." "Nasty eye you've got there, Scullion." "Slipped on the path, sir, I see. Very slippery." "Slippery. Got away, did he?" the Dean asked. "Yes, sir. Good for him. Nice to know there are still some undergraduates with spirit about." "Nothing else to report?" No, sir. Nothing to report. Nothing except Sheffy, sir." "Sheffy? What's the matter with him?" "Well, it's not just him, sir. It's all of us. Very upset about the master's speech," Scullion said carefully. The Dean swung his chair round and looked out of the window. Finally he said, "You can tell the chef there'll be no changes. The master was just feeling his way. He'll learn." "Yes, sir," said Scullion doubtfully. "Thank you, Scullion," said the Dean dismissively. "Thank you, sir," Scullion said and left the room. The Dean swung his chair back to his desk and took up his pen again. Scullion's resentment had inspired him with a new determination to block Sir Godber's schemes. There were all the old Porterhousians, for instance. Their opinion and influence could be decisive if properly organised. It might be as well to inform that opinion now.
"The trouble with the feast," said the Dean, munching a mouthful of cold beef, "is that it does tend to run on. Cold beef today and tomorrow and on Thursday. After that, I suppose we'll have stewed beef on Friday and Saturday and cottage pie on Sunday. By next week we should be getting back to normal."
"Difficult to eat an entire ox in one sitting," said the bursar. "One suspects our predecessors had, shall we say, grosser appetites."
The senior tutor took his place at the table. He was looking more than usually austere.
"Talking of gross appetites, I have the gravest doubts about some of our younger members. I have just had a visit from a young man who claims to be under some compulsion to sleep with his bedder."
He helped himself to horseradish. The bursar sniggered.
"Which one?"
"Zipser."
"Which bedder?"
"I didn't inquire. It didn't seem a particularly relevant question."
"Isn't he in the Bull Tower?"
the bursar asked the Dean.
"Zipser? Yes, I think he is."
"Oh, then it must be Mrs. Biggs."
The senior tutor, who had been debating what to do with a long piece of gristle, swallowed it.
"Dear me, Mrs. Biggs, I must say I did young Zipser an injustice." "Impossible to do an injustice to anyone with such depraved tastes," said the Dean firmly.
"Mrs. Biggs hardly comes within the category of forbidden fruit. What advice did you give him?"
The senior tutor looked at him disbelievingly.
"Advice? It is hardly my position to offer advice on such questions. I am the senior tutor, not a marriage guidance counsellor. As a matter of fact, I suggested he see the chaplain. It only goes to show what happens when you open the doors of the college to research graduates. In the old days, such a thing would have been unheard of."
"Unheard of, perhaps, but not, I think, unknown."
"With bedders? Maintain some sense of proportion, I beg you." "In the case of Mrs. Biggs," said the tutor, "it is precisely the question of proportion that is at stake."
"We had that last night."
They finished the meal in silence, each occupied with his own thoughts. It was only when they were assembled in the combination room for coffee that the discussion began again. For by then, the chaplain, totally oblivious to the conversation over dinner, had been persuaded to go to his room and invite Zipser to tea and a chat.
"Ah, my boy,"
the chaplain boomed as Zipser negotiated the bric-a-brac that filled his sitting room.
"So good of you to come. Do make yourself comfortable."
Zipser nudged past a gramophone with a papier-mâché horn, circumvented a brass-topped table with fret-sawed legs, squeezed beneath the fronds of a castor oil plant, and finally sat down on a chair by the fire. Zipser looked round the room for some indication of the chaplain's interests, but the welter of conflicting objects, like the addition of random numbers to a code, made interpretation impossible. Apart from the senility, the furnishings had so little in common that they seemed to indicate a wholly Catholic taste. The chaplain sat back in his chair and filled his pipe from a tobacco jar.
"Do help yourself, my dear boy,"
said the chaplain, pushing the jar towards him.
I don't smoke."
The chaplain shook his head sadly.
"Oh, everyone should smoke a pipe. Calms the nerves. Put things in perspective. Couldn't do without mine."
He leant back, puffing vigorously. Zipser stared at him through a haze of smoke.
Now then, where were we? The senior tutor said something. I didn't gather very much, but then I seldom do. Deafness, you know."
Zipser nodded sympathetically, and he tried to think what to say. The chaplain's age and his evident physical disabilities made it difficult for Zipser to conceive that he could begin to understand the problem of Mrs. Biggs.
"I really think there's been a misunderstanding," he began hesitantly and stopped.
It was evident from the look on the chaplain's face that there was no understanding at all.
You have to speak up," the chaplain boomed. "I'm really quite deaf."
"I can see that." The chaplain beamed at him.
I know what we'll do,"
he said, hopping to his feet and reaching behind his chair.
"It's something I use for a confession sometimes."
He emerged, holding a loudhailer, and handed it to Zipser.
Press the trigger. Where are you going to speak?"
Zipser held the thing up to his mouth and stared at the chaplain over the rim. "I really don't think this is going to help," he said finally. His words reverberated through the room. "Oh, yes, of course it is," shouted the chaplain. "I can hear perfectly." "I didn't mean that," Zipser said desperately. "I meant I don't think it's going to help to talk about—" He left the dilemma of Mrs. Biggs unspoken. The chaplain smiled in absolution and puffed his pipe vigorously. "Many of the young men who come to see me," he said, invisible in a cloud of smoke, "suffer from feelings of guilt about masturbation." Zipser stared frantically at the smoke screen. "Masturbation? Who said anything about masturbation?" he bawled into the loud hailer. His words, hideously amplified, billowed forth from the room and across the court outside. Several undergraduates turned and stared up at the chaplain's windows. Deafened by his own vociferousness, Zipser sat sweating with embarrassment. "I understood from the senior tutor that you wanted to see me about the sexual problem," the chaplain shouted. Zipser lowered the loud hailer. The thing clearly had disadvantages. "I can assure you I don't masturbate." The chaplain looked at him incomprehendingly. "You press the trigger when you want to speak?" Zipser nodded dumbly. The knowledge that to communicate with the chaplain at all, he had to announce his feelings for Mrs. Biggs to the world at large, presented him with a terrible dilemma made no less intolerable by the chaplain's shouted replies. "Don't forget that anything you tell me will be heard in the strictest confidence," the chaplain boomed. "You need have no fears that it will go any further." "Oh, sure," Zipser muttered. Outside in the quad, a small crowd of undergraduates had now gathered. Half an hour later, Zipser staggered from the chaplain's room, his demoralization quite complete. He had sat silently through a sexual catechism, only bothering to shake his head when the chaplain broached particularly obscene topics. He had listened to the lyrical description of the advantages of au pair girls, for it was obvious that the chaplain regarded foreign girls as outside the sexual canons of the church. "Find a nice Swedish girl," the chaplain had bellowed. "I'm told they're very good and have a ball. I believe that's the modern idiom. Yes, Swedes or French, depending on your taste." Zipser went down the dark staircase and was about to go out into the court when he saw the undergraduate standing there. He turned, fled up the stairs, and locked himself in the lavatory. During his hour in the lavatory, he had decided to take the chaplain's advice and find an au pair girl. Zipser's lack of sexual experience prevented him from formulating at all clearly what he would do then. Well, he would copulate with her. And before he fell asleep, he realized that he had forgotten one important detail. He would need some contraceptives. He'd go and have his hair cut in the morning and get some. The lodge door opened and Arthur, who waited at high table, came in. "Evening, Arthur," said Scullion condescendingly. "Evening," said Arthur. "Got something for you?" Scullion looked up. Arthur's attendance at high table was a source of much of his information about the college. He rose and came over to the counter. "Oh, they're in a tiz-whiz tonight. Proper tiz-whiz." "Go on," said Scullion encouragingly. "Oh, Bursar came in to dinner all flushed and flummoxy, and the dean's got them high spots on his cheek he gets when his gander's up, and the tutor don't eat his soup. Not like him to turn up his soup." Scullion grunted his agreement. Arthur continued, smiling. "Master's called a college council for tomorrow. The bursar said it wasn't convenient, and the master said to call it just the same, and they don't like it. They don't like it at all. Put them off their dinner, it did. The new master acting all uppity like that." "Can't call a college council all of a sudden. Council meets on the first Thursday of every month." "That's what the dean said, and the tutor. But the master wouldn't have it. Got to be tomorrow." Arthur shook his head mournfully over the master's wilfulness. Scullion scowled at him. "The master come to dinner?" "No, he don't stir from the lodge, just telephones his orders to the bursar." Scullion nodded pensively. "So, he's going ahead with his changes," he said at last. "What's the dean say to all this?"
Says they've all got to stick together.
Yeah, don't suppose the senior tutor agrees with him, Scullion suggested.
Oh, he do now. Didn't before, but this being told to attend the meeting has got him on the raw.
Scullion nodded. Ah, well, that's something. It isn't like him to side with the Dean. Thank you, Arthur. Very useful, that is.
Glad to be of service,
Arthur said as he moved towards the door.
Besides, I don't want any changes in the college any more than you do. Too old for changes, I am. 25 years I've waited at high table, and 15 years before that I was...
Scullion shut the door on old Arthur's reminiscences and went back to the fire. So the master was going ahead with his plans. Well, it wasn't a bad thing he'd ordered the college council for tomorrow. It had got the dean and the senior tutor to agree. That was something in itself. Zipser slept fitfully and was awake before 7. He dressed, made himself some coffee, and was just cutting himself some bread when Mrs. Biggs arrived.
"Oh, you're up early for a change?" she said. "What are you doing here now?" Zipser demanded belligerently. "You shouldn't come till 8.
Mrs. Biggs, fulsome in a red mackintosh, smiled dreadfully.
"I can come any time I want to," she said with quite unnecessary emphasis,
and began to unbutton her mac slowly with one hand, like a gargantuan stripper. Zipser's eyes followed her down. Her breasts swarmed in her blouse as she slipped the mac over her shoulders. Zipser's eyes salivated over them.
"Here, help me with the arms,"
Mrs. Biggs said, wedging herself round so that she had her back to him. Zipser hesitated for a moment, and then, impelled by a fearful and uncontrollable urge, lunged forward.
"Here!"
said Mrs. Biggs, somewhat surprised by the frenzy of his assistance and the unusual whinnying sound Zipser was making.
"The arms, I said. What do you think you're doing?"
Zipser floundered in the folds of her mac, his mind ablaze with overwhelming desire, as he thrust himself into the red inferno of the raincoat. The bedder hunched herself and then heaved. Zipser fell back, and Mrs. Biggs issued into the hall. Between them on the floor, like the plastic afterbirth of some terrible delivery, the disputed raincoat slowly subsided.
"Goodness gracious me,"
said Mrs. Biggs, recovering her composure.
"Ooh, you want to be more careful. You might give people the wrong idea."
"I'm sorry," he mumbled, hoping desperately she did not get the right idea.
"I must have slipped. I don't know what came over me. Wonder you didn't come all over me," Mrs. Biggs said coarsely, "throwing yourself about like that."
Zipser fled down the stairs, across the court and out through the gate. He had over an hour to wait before the barber's shops opened. In his bedroom, Mrs. Biggs tucked the sheets under the mattress of Zipser's bed with a practised hand and plumped his pillows with a mitigated force that was almost tender. She was feeling rather pleased with herself. Zipser's clumsy advances had not escaped her attention. The fact that he had followed her about from room to room as she worked, and that his eyes were seldom off her, were signs too obvious to be ignored. Now this latest episode had confirmed her best suspicions.
"Oh, fancy now," she said to herself. "And him such a nice young fellow, too. Who'd have guessed?"
She looked at herself in the mirror and primped her hair with a heavy hand. At 9:15, Zipser took his seat in the barber's chair.
Just a trim," he said.
The barber looked at his head doubtfully.
"Wouldn't like a nice short back and sides, I don't suppose," he said mournfully. "Just a trim, thank you."
The barber's scissors clicked busily round his ears. Zipser stared at himself in the mirror and wondered once again at the disparity between his innocent appearance and the terrible passion which surged inside him. His eyes moved sideways past rows of bottles, to the glass case to his left, where a box in one corner suggested the reason for his haircut. He couldn't move his head, so that he wasn't sure what it contained, but it looked the right sort of box. Finally, when the man moved forward to pick up the clippers, Zipser turned and saw that he had been eyeing with quite pointless interest a box of razor blades. He turned his head further and scanned the shelves. Shaving creams, razors, lotions, combs, all were there in abundance, but not a single carton of contraceptives. By the time the barber had finished, and he was powdering his neck and waving a hand mirror behind him, Zipser was in no mood to be critical of the result. He got out of the chair and waved the barber's brush away impatiently.
"That'll be 30 pence, sir," the barber said. "Is there anything else?"
Now was the moment he had been waiting for, the open invitation.
"I'll have 5 packets of Durex,"
Zipser said with a strangled bellow.
"Afraid we can't help you. Landlord's a Catholic. It's in the lease. We're not allowed to stock 'em."
"I think we can dispense with formalities," the master said, sitting forward in his chair and looking down the long mahogany table. On his left, the bursar fiddled with his pen, while on his right, the chaplain, accorded his position by virtue of his deafness, nodded his agreement. Down the long table, the faces of the council reflected their displeasure at this sudden meeting. "I have called this meeting," he continued with a nasty smile, "to discuss in detail the changes in the college I mentioned in my speech. I shan't keep you long. When I have finished, you can go away and think about my suggestions. The quality of our undergraduates has always seemed to me to be quite deplorable. I intend to change all that. From now on, we shall accept candidates who possess academic qualifications alone. That is my first point. The second is to announce that the college will become a co-educational institution from the beginning of the forthcoming academic year. Yes, gentlemen, from the beginning of next year, there will be women living in Porterhouse." The dean buried his face in his hands. The senior tutor put both his hands on the edge of the table to steady himself. Only the chaplain spoke.
"I heard that,"
he bellowed, his face radiant as if with divine revelation.
"I heard it. Splendid news. Not before time either."
The master beamed. "I accept your approval, chaplain, with thanks. It is good to know that I have support from such an unexpected quarter. Thirdly, the practice of dining in hall will be abandoned. A self-service canteen run by an outside catering firm will be established. There will be no high table. All forms of academic segregation will disappear. Yes, Dean?" But the dean was speechless. His face livid and congested, he had started to protest only to slump in his chair. "Not, I trust, another Porterhouse blue?" the master said audibly to the bursar, and looked at his watch with calculated unconcern. To the dean, Sir Godber's manifest lack of interest in his demise came as a stimulant. His face grew pale and his breathing less sibilant. He opened his eyes and stared with loathing down the table at the master. "As I was saying," continued Sir Godber, picking up the threads of his speech, "the measures I have proposed will transform Porterhouse at a stroke." He paused and smiled at the appositeness of the phrase. "May I remind you," the senior tutor snarled, "that this council is the governing body of the college, and that policy decisions affecting the running of the college are taken by the council as a whole. I should like to make it quite clear, and I think I can speak for the dean," he glanced at the speechless dean before continuing, "when I say we are both adamantly opposed to any changes in college policy." "In that case, gentlemen, there is little I can say," the master said sadly. "In the face of your opposition, I have little choice but to resign the mastership of Porterhouse." A gasp came from the fellows as the master rose. "I shall announce my resignation in a letter to the Prime Minister. An open letter, gentlemen, in which I shall state my reasons, namely that I am unable to continue as master of a college that augments its financial resources by admitting candidates without academic qualifications in return for large donations and selling degrees. The Prime Minister will doubtless pass my letter to the Director of Public Prosecutions. Good afternoon, gentlemen." The master turned and stalked out of the room. Behind him the fellows of Porterhouse sat rigid, each absorbed in calculating his own complicity in a scandal that must bring ruin to them all.
"He must be stopped,"
gurgled the dean, breaking the awkward silence.
"For the time being, perhaps, we must accept his proposals, but only for the time being."
"And then?" the senior tutor asked.
We must delay, buy time. Time to bring influence to bear upon Sir Godber, and time to subject his own career to the scrutiny he has seen fit to apply to the customs and traditions of the college. No man who has spent as long as Sir Godber Evans in public life is wholly without fault. It is our business to discover the extent of his weaknesses.
And if the master refuses to withdraw his resignation?
The bursar asked.
There is no possible reason why he should. I propose that we go now in a body to the master's lodge and ask him to reconsider.
Zipser was drunk. 8 pints of bitter, each drunk in a different pub, had changed his outlook on life. The narrow confines of his compulsion had given way to a brighter, more expansive frame of mind. After a second and equally fruitless haircut, he had suddenly recalled having seen a contraceptive dispenser in the lavatory of a pub. Zipser's spirits rose with the thought. He went into the first pub he came to and ordered a pint. 10 minutes later he left that pub empty-handed and found another only to be similarly disappointed. By the time he had been to 6 pubs and had drunk 6 pints of bitter, he was in a mood to point out the deficiencies of their service to the bartenders. At the 7th pub, after buying the usual pint, he struck gold. Zipser put 2 coins into the contraceptive machine, and his money rattled into the slot. The damned dispenser was empty. He went back to the bar and ordered an 8th pint.
That machine in the toilet,
he said conspiratorially to the barman.
What about it?
Barman asked.
It's empty.
That's right, said the barman. It's always empty.
Well, it's got some of my money in it.
The barman looked at him warily.
How do I know you put any money in? How do I know you're not just trying it on?
I don't see how I can. I haven't got it.
Very funny. If you've got any complaints to make about that dispenser, you take them to the suppliers.
He handed a card to Zipser.
You go and tell them your problems. They stock the machines, I don't, all right?
Zipser left the pub with the card and went down the road. He found the suppliers, went in and put the card down in front of a young man behind the counter.
I have come from the Unicorn. The dispenser is empty.
Well, already, the clerk said. I don't know what happens to them. They go so quickly.
I want...
Zipser began thickly, but the young man had disappeared through a door to the back.
Here you are, 2 gross, sign here,
said the clerk, reappearing from the back with 2 cartons which he plonked on the counter. Zipser was about to explain that he had merely come to ask for his money back when a woman came in. He suddenly felt sick. He picked up the ball pen and signed the slip, and then, clutching the 2 cartons, stumbled from the shop. By the time he got back to the pub, it was shut. Zipser tried knocking on the door without result. Finally, he gave it up and went back to Porterhouse. Sir Godber went out into the hall and let the deputation of fellows in.
"Well, gentlemen,"
he said when they had filed into his study,
"and what can I do for you now?"
The Dean shuffled forward.
We have reconsidered our decision, Master."
Behind him the members of the college council nodded obediently. Sir Godber looked round their faces and was satisfied.
"You wish me to remain as Master?"
Yes, Master."
"And this is the general wish of the council?"
"It is."
"You understand my conditions are final? They must be accepted as they stand?"
"Quite so, Master, quite so."
The Dean smiled weakly.
"In that case I shall postpone my decision until the next meeting of the college council. That will give us all time to consider the matter at our leisure. Shall we say next Wednesday at the same time?"
"As you wish, Master."
They trooped out, and Sir Godber, having seen them to the door, stood at the window watching the dark procession disappear into the winter darkness with a new sense of satisfaction. In the combination room that evening after high table, the senior tutor broached the topic of their next move.
"It would appear that we have until Wednesday to circumvent the Master's proposals."
The Dean finished his coffee.
"I have already made a move. I have arranged a meeting with Sir Cathcart Diath for this evening. His car should be waiting for me now.
He rose to his feet and gathered his gown about him.
May one inquire the purpose of this meeting?
The bursar asked.
I have requested this meeting because Sir Cathcart, as you all know, is president of the OPs. I think he should know what changes the Master proposes. Further, I think he should know the manner in which the Master has conducted himself in the matter. I fancy that there will be an extraordinary meeting of the Porterhouse Society next Tuesday to discuss the situation. I have high hopes that a resolution will be passed censoring Sir Godber for the dictatorial attitude he has adopted in his dealings with the College Council and calling for his immediate resignation from the Mastership.
But, Dean, surely that is most unwise, protested the senior tutor, thoroughly alarmed. If a motion of that sort is passed, the Master is bound to resign and to publish his confounded letter.
The Dean smiled. We shall get in first by demanding his resignation. The force of his letter to the PM will be dulled by the fact that the college authorities and the Porterhouse Society have both demanded his resignation on the grounds of incompetence. His so-called disclosures will have the appearance of being the action of a slighted and bitter man. Besides, I rather think you overestimate Sir Godber's political courage. Faced with the ultimatum we shall present at the council meeting on Wednesday, I doubt if he will risk a further confrontation.
But if the call for his resignation has already been published?
It won't have been. The motion will have been passed, I trust, unanimously, for its publication will be dependent on Sir Godber's attitude. If he persists in demanding the changes in the college, then we shall publish.
And if he resigns without warning?
We shall publish all the same. We shall muddy the issue until it is uncertain whether we forced his resignation or not.
The Dean turned and went out, his gown billowing darkly behind him. Zipser, cold and stiff, stirred on the floor of his room. He turned on his side and stared at the large cartons of 2 gross of guaranteed, electronically tested 3-teat vending machine pack contraceptives. Slowly the details of the day's events returned to him. Zipser clutched his head in his hands and tried to think what to do. There was only one solution. He mustn't be found with them. He'd have to get rid of the things. But how? He looked at his watch. 11 o'clock p.m. Got to hurry. Burn them. He looked at the gas fire and gave up the idea. Flush them down the lavatory. Better idea. He threw himself at the cartons and began to open them. First the outer carton, then the inner one, then the packet itself, and finally the foil wrapper. It was a laborious job. He'd never do it. He'd got to do it. Beside him on the carpet, a pile of empty packets slowly grew, and with it a pile of foil and a grotesque arrangement of latex rings looking like flattened and translucent button mushrooms. Lubricated with Sensitol, his hands were sticky, which made it even more difficult to tear the foil. Finally, after an hour, he'd emptied 1 carton. He gathered the contraceptives up and took a handful out to the landing and into the lavatory. He dropped them into the pan and pulled the chain. A rush of water, swirls, bubbles. The water subsided, and he stared down at 24 rubber rings floating defiantly in the pan. "For God's sake!" said Zipser desperately, and he pulled the chain again. 24 contraceptives smiled up at him. Zipser stared at the things frantically. If buying the damn things had been fraught with appalling difficulties, getting rid of them was a nightmare. He clutched the chain. For the 3rd time the cistern flushed, and Zipser was just studying the subsidence and counting the 6 contraceptives which remained immune to the rush of water when someone knocked on the door. "What the hell's going on in there?" a voice asked. It was Foxton, who lived in the room next door. Zipser looked hauntedly at the door.
"I got diarrhea,"
he said weakly.
"Well, must you pull that bloody chain so often?"
Foxton asked.
"I'm trying to sleep."
He went back to his room, and Zipser turned back to the pan and began fishing for the 6 contraceptives with a lavatory brush. By 1 o'clock he had managed to rid himself of 38. after having visited 6 lavatories on neighbouring staircases. At this rate, he would still be flushing lavatories all over the college when Mrs. Biggs arrived in the morning. Back in his room, he stared at the pile of foil and the packets. Got to get rid of them too. Put them behind the gas fire and burn them, he thought. And he was just wrestling with the gas fire and trying to make space behind it when the howling draught in the chimney gave him a better idea. He went to the window and looked out into the night. In the darkness outside, snowflakes whirled and scattered while the wind battered at the windowpane. A moment later he was kneeling beside the gas fire and undoing the hose of his gas ring. 5 minutes afterwards, the first of 250 inflated contraceptives bounced buoyantly against the sooty sides of the medieval chimney and disappeared into the night sky above. Zipser rushed to the window and gazed up for a glimpse of the winsome thing as it whirled away into the world, but the sky was too dark and there was nothing to see. He went back and fetched a torch and shone it up the chimney, but apart from 1 or 2 errant snowflakes, the chimney was clear. Zipser turned cheerfully back to the gas ring and inflated 5 more. Once again, the experiment was entirely successful. This was the answer. This was how he could dispose of the damn things. And soon he had acquired a wonderful dexterity. Onto the tube, gas on, gas off, a knot in the end and up the chimney. He became aware that something had gone wrong in the chimney. The bloated and strangulated rear of his last contraceptive was hanging suspended in the fireplace. Zipser gave it a shove of encouragement, but the poor thing merely bulged dangerously. Zipser peered up the chimney. It was crowded with eager contraceptives. He clambered out of the fireplace and sat on the floor wondering what to do. At least he had disposed of all too gross, even if some were lodged in the chimney stack. They were well hidden there, or would be once he had put the gas fire back in place. He would think of some way of disposing of them in the morning. He was too tired to think of anything now. He pushed the gas fire back into position, went through to his bedroom, and went to bed. He fell into a restless sleep, haunted by the thought that the logjam in his chimney might break during the coming day to issue with shocking ebullience above the unsuspecting college. He need not have worried. Porterhouse was already infested. The falling snow had seen to that. As each porcine Sensitol lubricated protective had emerged from the chimney stack, the melting snow had ended its night flight almost abruptly. Zipser had not foreseen the dangers of icing. The Dean arrived back at 2 o'clock. He was spiritually restored, though physically taxed by the day's excitements and Sir Cathcart's brandy. He knocked on the main gate, and Scullion, who'd been waiting up obediently for him, opened the postern and let him in. "Need any help, sir?" Scullion asked as the Dean tottered through.
"Certainly not," said the Dean thickly, and set off across the court.
Scullion followed him at a distance like a good dog, and saw him through the screens before turning back to his porter's lodge and bed. He had already shut the door and gone through into his back room when the Dean's strangled cry sounded from the new court. The Dean lay in the snow and cursed. He tried to imagine what he'd slipped on. It certainly wasn't the snow. Snow didn't squash like that. Snow certainly didn't explode like that, and even in these days of air pollution, snow didn't smell of gas like that. The Dean eased himself onto a bruised hip and peered into the darkness. A strange rustling sound, in which a sort of wheeze and the occasional squeak were intermingled, came from all sides. The court seemed to be alive with turgid and vaguely translucent shapes which gleamed in the starlight. The Dean reached out tentatively towards the nearest one and felt it bounce delicately away from him. He tried another and missed, and it was only at the 3rd attempt that he managed to obtain a grip. Holding the thing by its tail, he scrambled up and took it into a lighted doorway. There he looked at it with a growing sense of disgust and outrage. He held it head down, and the thing righted itself and turned head up. Holding it thus, he went out into the court and to the porter's lodge. To Scullion, emerging sleepily from his back room, the sight of the Dean, snowy and dishevelled, holding the knotted end of an inflated contraceptive, had about it a nightmare quality that deprived him of his limited amount of speech.
I have just found this in New Court, Scullion, said the Dean.
Ah, said Scullion. The Dean let go of the contraceptive, and it slowly drifted up to the ceiling.
There seems to be others of that ilk, continued the Dean, in the New Court. A great many others.
In the New Court, said Scullion slowly. The draught from the door had nudged the contraceptive next to the light bulb in the ceiling, and as the Dean opened his mouth to say that the New Court was alive with the things, the one above their heads touched the bulb, and both it and the bulb exploded. Blinded momentarily by the flash and bereft of the light of the bulb, the Dean and Scullion stood in darkness while fragments of glass and rubber descended on them.
There are more where that one came from,
said the Dean finally, and led the way out into the night air. Scullion reached behind the counter for his torch and followed the Dean. They passed through the screens, and Scullion shone his torch into New Court. Huddled like so many legless animals, some 200 contraceptives gleamed in the torchlight.
"Good,"
said Scullion irreverently.
"I want them cleared away before it gets light, Scullion," said the Dean. "No one must hear about this. The college reputation. You understand?"
"Yes, sir. I'll clear them away. Leave it to me."
"Good."
And with one last disgusted look at the obscene flock, went up the stairs to his rooms. In the early hours, Mrs. Biggs left her house and cycled across Cambridge to the side entrance of Porterhouse. Here she let herself in with a key she had used in the old days when she had bedded for the chaplain. She was about to make her way across New Court when a strange sound stopped her in her tracks. She peered round the archway. In the early morning light, Scullion was chasing a balloon, or something. Backwards and forwards across the ancient court he ran, until just as it seemed the thing was about to escape over the wall into the fellow's garden, there was a loud pop, and whatever it was, or had been, hung limp and tattered demalion upon the branches of a climbing rose. Scullion stopped, panting, and stared up at the object of his chase, and then, evidently inspired by its fate, turned and hurried towards the screens. Mrs. Biggs retreated as Scullion hurried by, and then, when she could see him heading for the porter's lodge, emerged and tiptoed through the contraceptives to the bull tower. She let herself into his room, crossed to Zipser's bedroom, and went inside. She switched on the bedside light. Zipser awoke from his troubled sleep and blinked. He sat up in bed and stared at Mrs. Biggs, brilliant in her red coat. It was evidently morning. It didn't feel like morning, but there was Mrs. Biggs, so it must be morning. He levered himself out of bed.
"Oh, sorry," he mumbled, groping for his dressing-gown. "Must have overslept."
His eye caught the alarm clock. It seemed to indicate 3:30. Must have stopped.
"Shush,"
said Mrs. Biggs with a terrible smile. "It's only 3:30.
"What the hell's going on?"
asked Zipser. Mrs. Biggs went back into the other room.
"I'll be with you in a minute,"
she called out in a hoarse whisper, and there was a rustle of clothes. Even to Zipser's befuddled mind, it was evident that Mrs. Biggs was undressing. He got up and went to the door.
"Oh, for God's sake! You mustn't do that!"
Mrs. Biggs emerged from the shadows. She had taken off her blouse. Zipser stared at her enormous brassiere.
"Darling, go back to bed. You mustn't stand and watch me. It's embarrassing."
She gave him a push, which sent him reeling onto the bed. Then she shut the door. In the front room, Mrs. Biggs divested herself of her bra and her panties. It was terribly cold. She went to the window and shut it. Then she crossed to the gas fire and lit it. Nice to get dressed in the warm, she thought, and went into the bedroom. Scullion, who had returned from the porter's lodge armed with a broom handle to which he had taped a pin, hurled himself into the shoal of contraceptives and struck about him, and by the time dawn broke he had cleared New Court. One or two had escaped into the fellow's garden, and he went through the archway in the wall and began spiking these. He had just run a small but agile one to earth in the rose garden when a dull, rumbling noise at the top of the bull tower made him turn and look up. Something was going on in the old chimney. The chimney pot at the top was shaking. The brickwork silhouetted against the morning sky appeared to be bulging. The rumbling stopped. to be succeeded by an almighty roar as a ball of flame issued from the chimney and billowed out before ascending above the college. Below it the chimney toppled sideways, crashed onto the roof of the tower, and with a gradually increasing rumble of masonry, the 14th century building lost its entire facade. Behind it the rooms were clearly visible, their floors tilted horribly and sagging. There were shouts and screams. People poured out of doorways, and windows opened all round the court. Scullion ignored the screams for help. He was busy chasing the last few remaining contraceptives when the master, clad in his dressing gown, emerged from the master's lodge and hurried to the scene of the disaster. As he rushed across the garden, he found Scullion trying to spear a contraceptive floating in the fish pond. "Go and open the main gates!" the master shouted at him. "Not yet," said Scullion taciturnly. "What do you mean, not yet?" the master demanded. "The ambulance men and the fire brigade will want to get in." "Not having any strangers in college till I've cleared these things up. Wouldn't be right." "There are injured people in there," he screamed. "So there are, but there's the college reputation to be thought of too." He leant across the pond and burst the floating bubble. Sir Godber turned and ran on to the scene of the accident. Scullion followed him slowly. "Got no sense of tradition," he said sadly, and shook his head.
"Those sweetbreads are delicious," said the Dean at dinner. "The coroner's inquest has given me a considerable appetite."
"Very tactfully handled," said the senior tutor. "I must admit I had anticipated a less magnanimous verdict. As it is, suicide never hurt anyone." "At least nobody has suggested that young Zipser was on drugs," said the bursar. "The police made a very thorough investigation, you know, and they found nothing." The Dean raised his eyebrows.
"Nothing? To the best of my knowledge, they took away an entire sackful of contraceptives."
"I was talking of drugs, Dean. There was a question of motive, you understand. The police seemed to think Zipser was in the grip of an irrational impulse." "From what I heard, he was in the grip of Mrs. Biggs. I suppose you can call Mrs. Biggs an irrational impulse. And as for the other things, I must admit I find a predilection for gas-filled contraceptives quite unaccountable." "It still doesn't explain the presence of Mrs. Biggs," said the bursar. "I'm inclined to think that anyone who could go to bed with Mrs. Biggs must have been either demented or motivated by a grossly distorted sense of social duty, and to have launched lethal contraceptives on an unsuspecting world argues a fanaticism." "On the other hand," said the bursar to the chaplain, "he had been to see you about his, compulsion for the good woman." They all looked at the chaplain questioningly.
"Mrs. Biggs good?"
shouted the chaplain.
"I should say so. Splendid woman."
"We were wondering if Zipser gave you any hint as to his motives."
"Motives? Perfectly obvious. Good old-fashioned lust."
The Dean shook his head.
"Whatever his motives," he said, "Zipser has certainly made our own position extremely awkward. It is difficult to argue against the need for change when members of the college make such an exhibition of themselves. The meeting of the Porterhouse Society has been cancelled. Sir Cathcart phoned me this morning to say that he thought we should wait until this whole affair had blown over. An unfortunate phrase, but one sees his point. The college can hardly afford another scandal just yet."
The fellows finished their dinner in silence. The bursar lived out. He dined in college as frequently as possible, though, thanks to his wife's cooking, and it was only by chance that he stayed on in his rooms after dinner. He had things to think about. The Dean's pessimism, for one thing, and his failure to solicit the help of Sir Cathcart. It might be as well, he thought, to consider transferring his tenuous loyalties to Sir Godber after all. The master had already shown himself to be a man of some determination, and properly handled might well reward him for his services rendered. After all, it had been the bursar who had given him the information which Sir Godber had used to browbeat the council. He was about to go home when there was a knock on the door. "Come in," he said. It was Sir Godber.
Bursar, I hope I'm not disturbing you. I was crossing the court when I saw your light, and I thought I would pop in."
The bursar rose to greet him with warm obsequiousness.
How good of you to come, Master. I was about to drop you a line asking if I could see you.
In that case, I'm delighted to have saved you the trouble, said Sir Godber as he sat in an armchair by the fire.
Had business about poor Zipser? It's going to be a costly business restoring the tower.
That was one of the topics I wanted to consult you about, Bursar. We'll have to set up a restoration fund, I should imagine.
I'm afraid so, Master, the Bursar said sadly.
In the ordinary way, and if the college were only less, shall we say, less antiquated in its attitudes, I dare say I could use my influence in the city to raise a substantial sum, but as it is I find myself in an ambiguous position.
Sir Godber trailed off airily, leaving the Bursar with a sense of infinite financial connections.
No, we shall simply have to fall back on our own resources.
We have so few.
We shall have to make what use we can of them, until such time as the college decides to give itself a more contemporary image. If only the council would see the importance of change. But then I dare say you agree with the Dean.
It was the moment the Bursar had been waiting for. The Dean has his own views, Master, and they are not ones I share. Sir Godber's eyebrows expressed encouragement with reservations. I have always felt that we were falling behind the times, continued the Bursar, anxious to win the full approval of those eyebrows. But as Bursar, I have been concerned with administration, and it does tend to leave little time for policy. The Dean's influence is quite remarkable, you know, and of course there is Sir Cathcart.
I gather Sir Cathcart intends to call a meeting of the Porterhouse Society.
He's cancelled it since the Zipser affair.
That's interesting. So the Dean is on his own, is he?
The Bursar's change of tune was encouraging, and Sir Godber was satisfied. It was time to talk frankly. He leant forward, and tapping the Bursar on the knee with a forefinger with a vulgar assurance,
"Between ourselves, I think we can circumvent the Dean. You mark my words. We'll have him where we want him."
The Bursar stared at Sir Godber in startled fascination. The man's crudity, the change from an assumed urbanity to this backstair forcefulness, took him by surprise, and Sir Godber noted his astonishment with satisfaction.
"He won't know his arse from his elbow by the time we finish with him."
The Bursar nodded meekly. Sir Godber hitched his chair forward and began to outline his plans. Scullion stood in the court and wondered at the lights burning in the Bursar's room. He's staying late. Usually home by 9. He is. He walked through to the back gate and locked it. Now he turned and made his way through the Fellows' Garden to New Court. The exertions of the chase had left him stiff and aching, and he still had not recovered from the shock of the explosion in the tower. "Getting old," he muttered, and stopped to light his pipe. As he stood in the shadow of a large elm, the light in the Bursar's room went out. He was about to leave the shelter of the tree when he saw 2 figures emerge from New Court and come towards him deep in conversation. Scullion recognized the master's voice.
"No doubt the Dean will object," Sir Godber was saying, "but I think we can take it that his days of influence are numbered."
"Not before time," said the Bursar. The 2 figures disappeared round the side of the master's lodge. Scullion emerged from the shadow and stood on the path, peering after them, his mind furiously occupied. So, the Bursar had gone over to Sir Godber. Scullion wasn't surprised. He'd never had much time for the Bursar. Scullion turned and made his way into New Court with a fresh sense of grievance and some perplexity. The Dean should be told, but Scullion knew better than to tell him. The Dean didn't approve of eavesdropping. He went through the screens and across to the porter's lodge and made himself some cocoa. "So the Dean's days are numbered, are they?" he thought bitterly. "We'll see about that." It would take more than Sir Godber Evans and the miserable Bursar to change things.
He got up and went outside to close the front gate. Above him in the tower, the clock struck 12. On the towpath by the river, the Dean stood huddled in his overcoat against the wind. Behind him the willows shuddered and shook, and the hedgerow rustled. In front, the Eights rode through choppy water, each with its coterie of coaches and supporters splashing through the puddles on their bicycles and shouting orders and encouragement. On every stroke the coxes jerked backwards and the boats leapt forward, each in pursuit of the Eight ahead, and each in turn in flight from the Eight behind. Occasionally a sudden burst of cheering signalled a bump, as one Eight touched the boat in front, and the two pulled into the side of the river. To the Dean, the ritual was a sacred occasion to be attended, no matter how cold or wet the weather, in memory of the healthy athleticism of the past and the certainties of his youth. When it was all over, he turned and trudged back to the Pike and Eel, where his car was parked. The Dean had reached the railway bridge when he was aware of a familiar figure in front. "Afternoon, Scullion. We rode over again," he said. Scullion nodded. "Jesus never looked like catching us," the Dean said. "And we should bump Trinity tomorrow. It was the choppy water that stopped us today." They walked on in silence, while the Dean recalled other bumps and famous crews, and Scullion tried to think of some way of broaching the subject of the bursar's treachery without offending the Dean's sense of what was proper for college servants to say. It wasn't easy even to walk beside the Dean. Not his place. Presently, Scullion gave up the unequal struggle with his conscience and gradually fell back a pace or two behind the old man. At the Pike and Eel, the Dean, still lost in thought, unlocked his car and climbed in. Scullion fetched his bicycle and wheeled it across the footbridge. Behind him, the Dean sat in his car and waited for the traffic to clear. He had forgotten Scullion. He had forgotten even the bumps and the youth they had recalled to him. He was thinking about Sir Godber, the glibness of his modernity, and the threat to Porterhouse he represented. He found himself staring at an advertisement. "Carrington on Conservation. The nation's heritage at stake," it said, and a face smiled at him from a television screen. A familiar face. A face he knew. The Dean stared at it, and was suddenly conscious of new hope. Back in his room, he checked the Porterhouse register for Cornelius Carrington's name. There it was, 1935 to 1938. The Dean closed the book and sat back contentedly. A nasty piece of work, Cornelius Carrington, but effective for all that. The Jeremiah of the BBC, they called him, and certainly he was popular, with his good-hearted nostalgia for the best that was British and immense family appeal. Elicit Cornelius Carrington's interest, and you were sure of an audience, and the wretched fellow was a Porterhouse man. Most of the discussion at the college council meeting centred on the cost of repairing the damage done to the tower. Sir Godber, it seemed, had very definite views on the subject. "It is time," he was saying, "that the college recognised the need to act in accordance with the principles which appear to have motivated the members of this council in the past. The changes which I proposed at our last meeting met with opposition on the grounds that Porterhouse is a self-sufficient and independent college. For myself, as you know, that view is without foundation, but I am prepared to accept it since it appears to represent the views of the majority of this council." The master paused, evidently looking round the fellows for approval. "Are we to understand that you have conceded that there is no need for the changes you proposed at our last meeting?" the Dean asked. "The point I am conceding, Dean, is that the college is responsible for its own internal affairs. I am prepared to accept the views of the council that we should not look for guidance or assistance from the public." "I should certainly hope not," said the senior tutor fervently. "Since that is the case, the full responsibility for the recent tragic events must be borne by the college. In particular, the cost of the repairs to the tower must be met out of our own resources." A murmur of astonishment greeted the master's statement. "Impossible," said the Dean angrily. "Out of the question. I must say, Dean, that I find your attitude a little difficult to understand. On the one hand, you are opposed to any changes that would bring Porterhouse into line with contemporary standards of education, and on the other, you seem only too ready to appeal to public subscription to avoid the necessary economics required to rebuild the tower. And not surprisingly, the economics Sir Godber had in mind seemed to embody just those changes in college policy he had suggested at the previous meeting, but this time the master was arguing less from policy than from financial necessity. And now Ryder Street was mentioned. Ryder Street was college property. Scullion lived in Ryder Street. And when Scullion heard, in that mysterious way he seemed to hear so much that was confidential, he was possessed by a new fury. His bitterness against Sir Godber sprang no longer from a concern for the traditions of the college. Now it came from a sense of personal betrayal. Ryder Street, number 41, where he lived, where he had planned to retire. It had been one of the conditions of employment. The college had provided a house at a nominal rent. He had not worked for 45 years at a pittance a week to be evicted from a house that was to be sold over his head by Sir Godber. They couldn't sell it. They'd got no right. But Sir Godber did not know this as he spoke at the college council. The bursar and I have calculated that the cost of the repairs can be met by the economies I have outlined, said Sir Godber. The sale of Ryder Street in particular will provide something in the region of £150,000 at today's inflated prices. The Dean had driven over to see Sir Cathcart with the latest news and the suggestion he invite Cornelius to Cambridge, and Scullion stood alone in the biting wind, watching Porterhouse row over for the second day running. The terrible sense of wrong, when he learned of the proposed sale of Ryder Street, had not left him. It had been augmented by the news Arthur had brought him from the high table after lunch. "Oh, he's put the cat amongst the pigeons now, the master has," Arthur said breathlessly. "He's got under their skin something terrible this time." "I don't wonder," said Scullion, thinking bitterly of Ryder Street. "I mean, you wouldn't want one in your own home, would you? Not one of them things." "What things?" Scullion asked, all too conscious of the fact that he was unlikely to have a home to put anything in if Sir Godber had his way. "Frenchies. A machine that sells Frenchies." "Frenchies? What Frenchies?" "The Frenchies that Zipser gentleman exploded himself with." Scullion looked at him in disgust. "You mean to tell me they're going to bring one of those filthy things into the college?" Arthur nodded. "In the men's toilet. That's where it's going." "Over my dead body," said Scullion. "I'm not staying here as head porter with one of those things in the toilet. This isn't a bloody chemist shop." Arthur shook his head sorrowfully. "'Tisn't right," he said. "'Tisn't right, Mr. Scullion. I don't know what the college is coming to." When the Porterhouse 8 rode past, Scullion raised a feeble cheer, but, like the Dean the day before, he was lost in thought and bitterness. His anger, unlike the Dean's, was tainted with a sense of betrayal. The college, whose servant he was, had let him down. They had no right to let Sir Godber sell Ryder Street. They should have stopped him. That was their duty to him, just as his duty to the college had been for 45 years, to sit in the porter's lodge all day and half the night for a miserable pittance a week. He had been secure in the knowledge that the college would always look after him, now and in his old age. He had been proud of his civility, the porter of Porterhouse. But what if the college's reputation was debased? What would he be then? A homeless old man with his memories. He wasn't having it. They'd got to see him right. It was their duty. Cornelius Carrington travelled to Cambridge by train. It accorded with the discriminating nostalgia which was the hallmark of his programmes, that he should catch the Fenman at Liverpool Street and spend the journey in the dining car speculating on the suddenness of the invitation, while observing his fellow travellers and indulging in British Rail's high tea. As he sat in the dining car, Carrington's thoughts turned from tea cakes to the ostensible reasons for his visit. The invitation had come too abruptly both in manner and in time to convince him that it was wholly ingenuous. Carrington had listened to the news of recent events in Porterhouse with interest. His ties with his old college had been tenuous, to put it mildly, and he shared with Sir Godber some unpleasant memories of the place and his time as an undergraduate. At the same time, he recognised that the changes, regretted in other colleges and feared in Porterhouse, might have a value for a series on Cambridge. Carrington on Cambridge. It was an excellent title, and the notion of a personal view of the university by an old freshman appealed to him. By the time the train reached Cambridge, he had already begun to organise the programme in his mind. He took a taxi and drove to the Belvedere Hotel. It was not what he remembered. The old hotel, charming in a quiet, opulent way, was gone, and in its place there stood a large, modern monstrosity, as tasteless a monument to commercial cupidity as any he had ever seen. Cornelius Carrington's fury was aroused. He would definitely make the series now. Rejecting the anonymous amenities of the Belvedere, he cancelled his room and took the taxi to the Blue Boar. Here, too, things had changed, but at least from the outside the hotel looked what it had once been, an 18th-century hostelry, and Carrington was satisfied. After all, it is appearances that matter, he thought, as he went up to his room. At any previous time in his life, Scullion would have agreed with him, but now that his house in Ryder Street was up for sale, and the college's reputation threatened by the master's flirtation with the commercial aspects of birth control, Scullion was less concerned with appearances. He skulked in the porter's lodge, with a new taciturnity in marked contrast to the gruff deference he had accorded callers in the past. For hours he would sit staring at the gas fire, mulling over his grievances and debating what to do. "Got no right to do it!" he would suddenly say out loud, with a violence that made Walter, the under-porter, jump. "No right to do what?" he asked at first. "It's none of your business," Scullion snapped back, and Walter gave up the attempt to discuss whatever it was that had put the head porter's back up. Even the dean, never the most sensitive of men when it came to other people's feelings, noticed the change in Scullion when he called each morning to make his report. It was during one of their many discussions about money that the bursar mentioned Scullion's new abruptness to Sir Godber. "Scullion costs us approximately £1,000 a year," he said. "More if you take the loss on the house in Ryder Street. Altogether the college servants mean an annual outflow of £15,000. Scullion certainly isn't worth that. And besides, I find his attitude decidedly obnoxious. Not only that, but I dislike the proprietary attitude he takes to the college. Anyone would think he owns the place. He'll have to go." For once the bursar did not disagree. "He'll be reaching retiring age in a few years' time," he said. "Do you think we should wait—" But Sir Godber was adamant. "I don't think we can afford to wait. It's a simple question of redundancy. There is absolutely no need for 2 porters." "But Scullion is getting on. He's an old man," said the bursar, who saw looming before him the dreadful task of telling Scullion that his services were no longer required. "Precisely my point. We can hardly sack the under-porter, who is young, simply to satisfy Scullion, who, as you say yourself, will be retiring in a few years' time. We really cannot afford to indulge in sentimentality, bursar. You must speak to Scullion. Suggest that he look around for some other form of employment. Must be something he can do." The summons to the bursar's office caught Scullion in a rare mood of melancholy and self-criticism. "Scullion," said the bursar with a nervous geniality. "Good of you to come." Scullion stood in front of the desk and waited. "You wanted to see me?" Yes. Do sit down." The bursar shuffled some papers and then looked fixedly at the doorknob, which he could see slightly to the left of the porter. "I don't really know how to put this," he began, with a delicacy of feeling that was wasted on Scullion. "What?" said the porter.
Well, to put the matter in perspective, Scullion, the college financial resources are not all they should be.
I know that.
Yes. Well, for some years now we've been considering the advisability of making some essential economies.
Not in the kitchen, I hope?
No, not in the kitchen.
Could always raise money in the old days by asking the Porterhouse Society. Lot of rich gentlemen still. They wouldn't want to see changes in the kitchen. They'd chip in. You ask them.
The bursar tried to think how to bring the conversation back to its original object. There are other economies we have to make.
Like selling Ryder Street, I suppose.
We simply haven't got the money to do anything else, said the bursar lamely.
It's always money. Everything gets blamed on money. He got up and walked to the door. Doesn't mean you've got the right to sell my home. Wouldn't have happened in the old days.
He went out and shut the door behind him. The bursar sat at his desk and stared after him. He was still sitting there 10 minutes later when there was a knock on the door and the head porter reappeared. "Yes, Scullion?"
"I'm prepared to help the college."
"Well, that's very good of you, Scullion. But,
It isn't very much, but it's all I can do. You'll have to wait till tomorrow for it, till I've been to the bank."
The bursar looked at him in astonishment. "The bank? You don't mean—"
"Well, it's college property, really. It's only £1,000. Something old Lord Wooford left me in his will. Well, if it—"
"My dear Scullion, really this is... Well, it's extremely good of you, but we couldn't possibly accept a gift from you."
"Why not?"
Well, it's out of the question. You'll need it yourself for your retirement."
"I ain't retiring," Scullion said firmly.
The bursar stood up. "It's about your retirement that I wanted to see you," he said with a determined harshness. "It has been decided that it would be in your own interest if you were to seek other employment." He stopped and stared out of the window. Behind him, Scullion had sagged on the chair. "Sacked," he said, with a hiss of air that sounded as if he were expiring with disbelief. The bursar turned reassuringly. "Not sacked, Scullion, not sacked. Just, well, for your own sake, for everyone's sake, it would be better if you looked around for another job." Scullion stared at him with an intensity that alarmed the bursar.
"You can't do it," he said, rising to his feet. "You've got no right. No right at all."
"Scullion," the bursar began warningly.
"You've sacked me!"
Scullion roared, and his face, which had been briefly pale, flushed to new and terrible red.
"After all these years I've given to the college, you've sacked me!"
"Now, Scullion," the bursar began as the porter loomed at him. But Scullion only stared a moment, and then rushed from the office, slamming the door behind him. The bursar subsided into his chair, limp and exhausted. Cornelius Carrington spent the day in rehearsal. With a cultivated eccentricity, he wandered through the colleges, singling out the architectural backdrops against which his appearances would be most effective. And all the time his mind revolved around the question which had been bothering him since his arrival. The programme, as he visualized it, lacked the human touch. It was not enough to conduct 1 million viewers on a guided tour of Cambridge colleges. There had to be a moral in it somewhere, a human tragedy that touched the heart and raised the Carrington programme from the level of aesthetic nostalgia to the heights of drama. He'd find it somewhere, somehow. He had a nose for the undiscovered miseries of life.
In the mid-afternoon he found himself in Porterhouse. Here, if anywhere in Cambridge, time stood still. The blackened walls of brick and clunch were as they had been in his day. The cobbled court with its chapel in the Gothic style, its lawns and its great hall through whose stained-glass windows the winter sun glowed richly. All was as he remembered. And with the memory there came the uneasy feeling of his own inadequacy, which had been his mood in those days, and which, in spite of his renown, he had never wholly eradicated. Steeling himself, he climbed the worn steps to the screens and stood for a moment studying the notices posted in the glass cases there. Here, too, nothing had changed. The boat club, fixture lists. With a sudden shudder, Carrington turned away from this reminder that Porterhouse was a rowing college and stood in the archway looking down into New Court with astonishment. Here, things had changed. Plastic sheeting covered the front of the tower, and broken masonry lay heaped on the flags below. Carrington gaped at the extent of the destruction, and was about to go down to make a closer examination when a small figure, heavily muffled in an overcoat, panted up the steps behind him, and he turned to find himself face to face with the Dean. "Good afternoon," Carrington said, relapsing suddenly into a deference he thought he had outgrown. The Dean stopped and looked at him. "Good afternoon," he said, suppressing the glint of recognition in his eye. "We haven't seen you for a long time, have we?" Carrington shrank a little at the supposition that his viewers, however numerous elsewhere, did not include the senior members of his old college. "To my knowledge, you haven't been back since, the Dean fabricated a tussle with his memory. 1938, wasn't it?" Carrington agreed humbly that it was, and the Dean, secure now in his traditional role as the ward of an ineffable superiority, asked, "You'll join me for tea?" And Carrington, already reduced to a submissiveness that infuriated him, thanked him for the offer. The unplanned tea-party over, Cornelius hurried out into the streets of Cambridge and found himself at the pub Thames Boatman. "Pint of bitter, please," he told the barman, with his usual sense of place. Gin and tonic in such a pub would have been unthinkable. "Seem to have been a lot of changes since I was here last." "Knocking the whole street down," said the barman laconically. "Must be bad for business." "'Tis, it isn't," the barman agreed. Carrington gave up the attempt to make conversation and took his beer to a table by the window. A short time later, a man in a bowler hat entered the bar and ordered a Guinness. Carrington studied his back and found a vague familiarity there. The dark overcoat, the highly polished shoes, the solid neck, and above all, the square set of the bowler hat. All these were tokens of a college porter. But it was the jutting bulldog pipe that woke his memory and told him this was Scullion. A waft of blue smoke reached Carrington. He sniffed, and in that sniff the years receded, and he was back in the porter's lodge in Porterhouse. Scullion. He had forgotten the man and his stiff, wooden, almost military ways. Carrington drank his beer and ordered another. As he waited for it, he crossed to the table where Scullion sat. "It's Scullion, isn't it?" Scullion looked up at him doubtfully. "What if it is?" he asked, adopting the impersonal pronoun as if to avoid the intrusion of his privacy. "I thought I recognized you. You probably wouldn't remember me. Carrington. I was up at Porterhouse in the 30s.
"Yes, I remember you. You had rooms over the hall."
"Let me get you another drink. Guinness, isn't it?" And before Scullion could say anything, Carrington had returned back to the barman and was ordering a Guinness. Scullion regarded him morosely. He remembered Carrington all right. Bertie, they used to call him. Flirty Bertie. Not a gentleman. Carrington brought the glasses across and sat down. "I suppose you've retired now?"
"Not what you might call retired,"
You mean you're still head porter after all these years? He spoke with the affected eagerness of an interviewer, and indeed something about Scullion had awoken in him the feeling that there was a story here.
45 years,
said Scullion, and drank his stout. 45 years, echoed Carrington. Huh, remarkable. Huh, Scullion grunted. There was nothing remarkable about it to him. The college doesn't seem to have changed much, anyway. Scullion's scowl deepened.
Changed more than you know. It's going to change out of recognition now.
Huh, you mean the new master? Carrington inquired.
Him and all the rest of them. Women in college. Self-service canteen in hall. And what about us as served the college all our lives? Out on the street like dogs?
Scullion drank his beer and banged the glass down on the table. Carrington was silent. He sat still, almost invisible with interest, like a predator that sees its prey.
45 years I've been a porter. A lifetime, wouldn't you say?
Carrington nodded solemnly. And now they've turned you out.
They've got no right to do it,
Scullion said, almost to himself.
They wouldn't have done it in the old days.
I seem to remember, in my day, that the college had rather a good reputation among the servants. Scullion looked at him with new respect.
Yes, sir. Porterhouse was known for its fairness.
That's what I thought, said Carrington, adopting the lordly manner which was evidently what Scullion required of him.
Oh, Lord Wooford wouldn't have dreamt of turning the head porter into the streets. When he died, he left me £1,000. Offered it to the bursar I did to help the college out. Turned me down. Would you believe it? Turned my offer down. It's not credible, is it?
To Carrington, credibility hardly mattered. The story was enough.
They're selling Ryder Street too.
Ryder Street?
Where all the college servants live, turning us all out.
Turning you out? They can't do that.
They are. Chef, the head gardener, Arthur, all of us.
Carrington finished his beer and bought 2 more. He had the human touch he had been seeking, and with it the knowledge that his visit had not been wasted. He had his story now. The Dean smiled. He had enjoyed his tea with Carrington. It was seldom nowadays that he had the opportunity to put his gifts for malice to good use, and Carrington had suffered his jibes in silence. They would fester in him and give him the edge that was needed. He would do the programme on Porterhouse. As for its contents, the Dean felt secure in the knowledge that Carrington was the high priest of nostalgia. Sir Godber's plans would be the bait, tradition sullied, the old and proven ways under threat. The Dean could hear the clichés now, rolling off Carrington's tongue to stir the millions hungry for the good old days. And what of Sir Godber himself? Carrington would make mincemeat of the man's pretensions. He went down to dinner in high spirits. They were having Canneton à l'orange, and the Dean was fond of duck. He entered the combination room and was surprised to find the master already there talking to the senior tutor. He had forgotten that Sir Godber dined in hall occasionally.
Good evening, master.
Good evening, Dean. I've just been discussing this business of the Restoration Fund with the senior tutor. It seems that we've had an offer for Ryder Street from Mercantile Properties. They've offered 150,000. I must say I'm inclined to accept. What's your opinion? The Dean grasped his gown and frowned. His objections to the sale of Ryder Street were tactical. He opposed what Sir Godber proposed on principle, but now it was useful that the master should commit himself to an act whose lack of charity Cornelius Carrington could emphasize.
Opinion? I have no opinion on the matter. I regard the sale of Ryder Street as a betrayal of our trust to the college servants. It is not an opinion, it is a matter of fact.
Ah, well, we shall just have to differ, won't we? The senior tutor was conciliatory. It's a hard decision to make, I do see that. A very difficult decision. They trooped into hall, and in the absence of the chaplain, the dean said grace. They ate in silence for a while, Sir Godber munching his duck and congratulating himself on the change in the senior tutor's attitude, due possibly to the poor showing of the college in the bumps, and one or two unfortunate remarks by the dean. Eager to exploit the rift, Sir Godber set out to cultivate him. And all the while, the dean remained patently uninterested, his eyes fixed on tables where the undergraduates sat talking noisily, and his mind entertained by the fuse that had been lit in Cornelius Carrington. Towards the end of the meal, the master turned to matters nearer home. "My wife is most anxious that you should dine with us one evening," he said to the senior tutor. "She is concerned to know your views on the question of lady tutors for our female undergraduates." "Lady tutors?" said the senior tutor. "Lady tutors?" "Naturally, as a co-educational college, we shall require some female fellows," the master explained. "Charming," said the dean nastily. "This comes as something of a shock, master." Sir Godber helped himself to Stilton. "There are some matters, senior tutor, that are essentially feminine, if you see what I mean. You would hardly want a young woman coming to you for advice about an abortion." The senior tutor disengaged himself from a mango precipitately. "Certainly not," he spluttered. "It's an eventuality we have to consider, you know. These things do happen, and since they do, it would be as well to have a lady tutor." Down the table the dean smiled happily. "And possibly a resident surgeon," he suggested. The master flushed. "You find the topic amusing, Dean?" "Not the topic, master, so much as the contortions of the liberal conscience," said the dean, settling back in his chair with relish. "We admit women to a previously all-male college on the grounds that their exclusion is clearly discriminatory. Having done so, we find it necessary to provide a contraceptive dispenser in the junior lavatory and an abortion centre doubtless in the matron's room. Such a splendid prospect for parents to know that the welfare of their daughters is so well provided for. No doubt in time there will be a college creche and a clinic." "Sex is not a crime, Dean?" "In my view, premarital intercourse comes into the category of breaking and entering," said the dean. He pushed back his chair, and they stood while he said grace. Cornelius Carrington spent the morning in his hotel room organising his thoughts. It was one of his characteristics as a spokesman for his time that he seldom knew what to think about any particular issue. On the other hand, he had an unerring instinct about what not to think. Even now, faced with the simple case of Scullion's sacking, he needed to decide which side the angels were on. Scullion was irrelevant, the object of an issue and superbly telegenic, but otherwise unimportant. He would be paraded before the cameras, encouraged to say a few inarticulate but moving sentences, and sent home with his fee to be forgotten. It was the issue that bothered Carrington. Who to blame for the injustice done to the old retainer? What aspect of Cambridge life to deplore, the old or the new? Sir Godber, who was evidently doing his best to turn Porterhouse into an academic college with modern amenities in an atmosphere of medieval monasticism, or the dean and the fellows whose athletic snobbery Carrington found personally so insufferable. On the surface, Sir Godber was the culprit, but there was much to be said for lambasting the dean, without whose obstinacy the economies which necessitated sacking the head porter would have been avoided. He would have to see Sir Godber. It was necessary in any case to get his permission to do the programme. Carrington picked up the phone and dialed the master's lodge. "Ah, Sir Godber," he said when the master answered. "My name is Carrington, Cornelius Carrington." He paused and listened to the master's voice change tone from indifference to interest. Sir Godber was evidently a man who knew his media, and rose accordingly in Carrington's estimation. "Of course. Come to lunch," Sir Godber gushed. Carrington said he'd be delighted to. Sir Godber sat in his study invigorated. A programme on Porterhouse by Cornelius Carrington. It was an unexpected stroke of luck. A chance for him to appear once more in the public eye, and a golden opportunity to propound his philosophy of education. He was still engrossed in composing an unrehearsed account of the changes he had in mind for the college when the doorbell rang, and the au pair girl announced Cornelius Carrington. The master rose to greet him. "How very nice of you to come. I had no idea you were an old Porterhouse man, and to be perfectly honest, I still find it hard to believe. I don't mean that in any derogatory sense, I assure you. It's just that I've come to associate the college with a rather less concerned approach to contemporary problems." Conscious that he was perhaps being a little too effusive, the master offered him a drink. Carrington accepted and began to warm to the master. Sir Godber's adulation came as a pleasant change from the dean's polite asperity. "This programme of yours on the college is a splendid idea," Sir Godber continued when they were seated. "Just the sort of thing the college needs. A critical look at old traditions and an emphasis on the need for change. I imagine you have something of that sort in mind?" "Oh, quite," said Carrington. Sir Godber's generalities left every option open. "Though I don't imagine the dean will approve." Sir Godber looked at him keenly. The hint of malice he detected was most encouraging. "A wonderful character, the dean, though a trifle hidebound." "A genuine eccentric," agreed Carrington dryly. It was evident from his manner that the dean did not command his loyalty. Reassured, the master launched into analysis of the functions of the college system in the modern world. Sir Godber's faith in the future was almost as insufferable as the dean's condescension, and Carrington's erratic sympathies veered back towards the past. It was raining when Scullion left the porter's lodge with his few belongings in a battered suitcase. The rain gathered on his bowler hat and flecked his face, so that it was difficult even for him to know if there were tears running down his nose or not. He crossed the iron footbridge and came to Ryder Street. He went inside number 41 and took off his coat and put the suitcase on the kitchen table. He sat down and took his shoes off. He made a pot of tea and sat at the kitchen table wondering what to do. He fetched a tin of boot polish and a duster and began to polish the toe-caps of his shoes. And slowly, as each toe-cap began to gather lustre under the gentle circling of his finger, Scullion lost the sense of hopelessness. Finally, taking a clean duster, he gave a final polish to the shoes and held them up to the light. He got up and put the duster and the tin of polish away and made himself some supper. He was himself again, the porter of Porterhouse, and with this restoration of his own identity there came a new stubbornness. He had his rights. They couldn't turn him out of his own home and his job. Something would happen to stop them. At 10 o'clock he went to bed and lay in the darkness, unable to sleep. Midnight he got up and shuffled downstairs almost automatically and opened the front door. It had stopped raining, and Scullion shut the door again after peering up and down the street. Then, reassured by this act of commemoration, he lit the gas fire in the front room and made himself a pot of tea. At least he had still got his legacy from Lord Wooford. He'd go to the bank in the morning.
"Shares?"
the bank manager said. He looked down at the details of Scullion's deposit account.
Yes, £5,000 is quite sufficient, but don't you think it would be wiser to put the money to something less speculative?"
Scullion shifted his hat on his knees and wondered why no one seemed to listen to what he said.
"I don't want to buy any shares. I want to buy a house."
The manager looked at him approvingly.
"Oh, yes, much better idea. Put your money in property, especially in these days of inflation. You have a property in mind?"
"It's in Ryder Street."
"Ryder Street?"
The manager raised his eyebrows.
Oh, that's a different matter. It's being sold as a lot, you know. You can't buy individual houses in Ryder Street, and quite frankly, I don't suppose your 5,000 would match some of the other bids. In fact, it's doubtful if 5,000 would get you anything in Cambridge. You'd have to raise a mortgage, and at your age, that's not an easy matter.
Scullion produced the envelope containing his shares.
I know that. That's why I want to sell these shares. There are 10,000. I think they're worth £1,000.
The manager took the envelope.
Yeah, we must just hope they're worth a little more than that. Now then.
His condescendingly cheerful tone stuttered out.
Good God!
He said, and stared at the sheaf of shares before him.
Amalgamated Universal Stores. This is quite extraordinary. How many did you say?
The manager was on his feet now, twittering.
10,000. 10,000.
The manager sat down again. He picked up the phone and rang the investment department.
Amalgamated Universal Stores, what's the current selling price?
There was a pause while the manager studied Scullion with a new, incredulous respect.
25.5.
He put the phone down and stared at Scullion.
Mr. Scullion, this may come as something of a shock to you. I don't quite know how to put it. But you are worth £250,000.
Scullion heard the words, but they had no visible effect upon him. He sat unmoved upon his chair and stared numbly at the bank manager. It was the manager himself who seemed most affected by the sudden change in Scullion's status. He laughed nervously and with a slight hysteria.
I don't think there's much doubt that you could make a bid for Ryder Street now,
he said at last, but Scullion wasn't listening. It was a rich man. It was something he had never dreamed of being.
Oh, there must have been dividends?
Scullion nodded.
In the building society.
He got up and put the chair back against the wall. He looked at the shares which represented his fortune.
You'd better put them back in the safe.
But,
began the manager.
Now, Mr. Scullion, sit down and let's discuss this matter. Ryder Street. There's no need to think of Ryder Street now. We can sell these shares, or at least some of them, and you can purchase a decent property and settle down to a new life.
Scullion considered the suggestion.
I don't want a new life, he said grimly. I want my old one back.
During the next 2 days, Cornelius Carrington was intensely busy. His dapper figure trotted across lawns and up staircases with a retinue of cameramen and assistants. Everyone cooperated. Even the Dean, convinced that he was heaping coals of fire on the master's head, consented to discuss the need for conservatism in the intellectual climate of the present day. He launched into a ferocious attack on permissive youth and extolled the celibacy of previous generations of undergraduates. In contrast, the chaplain was driven to admit that what many supposed to have been a nunnery before it was burnt down in 1541 had in fact been a brothel. The senior tutor was filmed cycling along the towpath coaching an 8, and was then interviewed in hall on the dietary requirements of athletes. Carrington wheedled out of him the fact that the annual feast cost over £2,000, and then went on to ask if the college made any contribution to Oxfam. At this point, forgetful of his electronic audience, the senior tutor told him to mind his own business and stalked out of the hall, trailing the broken lead of his throat microphone. Sir Godber was treated more gently. He was allowed to stroll across New Court and through the screens, discoursing on the need for a progressive and humanitarian role for Porterhouse. Carrington steered him to the subject of social compassion, which he saw as the true benefit of a university education. The master agreed that a sense of social justice was indeed the hallmark of the educated mind. Carrington stopped the cameras, and Sir Godber made his way back to the master's lodge, certain that he had ended on the right note. Carrington thought so too. While his cameramen took close-ups of the heraldic beasts on the front of the main gate and panned along the spikes that guarded the back wall, Carrington drove over to Ryder Street and spent an hour closeted with Scullion. "All I want you to do is to come back to the college and talk about your life as head porter." Scullion shook his head. "You'll do me in London, or you won't do me at all," he insisted. "In London?" "Haven't been to London for 13 years. And I want to go out live." "Live?" "In a studio, like they do on Panorama. It's more natural, isn't it?" "No, it's extremely unnatural. It's hot, and you have large cameras." "That's the way I want it. I'm not doing it any other way. Live." A week later, Carrington and Scullion travelled to London together. Carrington had spent the week editing the film and adding his commentary, but all the time he'd been harassed by a nagging suspicion that there was something wrong. Not with the programme, as he had finally concocted it, but with Scullion. The petulance that had attracted Carrington to him in the first place had gone out of him. In its stead there was a stillness and an impression of strength. It was as though Scullion had gained in stature since his dismissal, and was pursuing interests he knew to be his own and no one else's. As they drove to London, Carrington coached Scullion in his role. "Remember to look straight into the camera. Just answer my questions simply." In the darkness, Scullion nodded silently. Carrington decided to give Scullion a rehearsal, and when it was over, he was satisfied. He could relax. It was going to go well. From the television set in the combination room of Porterhouse College, Cornelius Carrington's voice broke through the last bars of the Eton boating song which had accompanied the opening shots of the backs and the King's College Chapel. "To many people, Cambridge is one of the great centres of learning, the birthplace of science and of culture. Here the great English poets had their education. Here Newton first discovered the laws of gravity, and Rutherford, the father of the atom bomb, first split the atom. But tonight we are going to look at a college that is unique, even in the unchanging world of Cambridge." The master sat forward and stared at the college crest on the tower above the main gate. Around him the fellows stirred uneasily in their chairs. The invasion of their privacy had begun, and it continued. Carrington asked his audience to consider the anachronism that was his old college. There was an implication in his tone of voice that Porterhouse was something more than a mere college, and that the crisis of old versus new which had developed there was somehow symbolic of the choice that confronted the country. In the combination room, the fellows gaped at the screen in amazement. And when, after floating through Old Court and the screens, the camera zoomed in on the plastic sheeting of the tower, there was a unanimous gasp. "What drove a brilliant young scholar to take his life, and that of an elderly woman, in this strange fashion?" Carrington asked, and proceeded to describe the circumstances of Zips's death. "I asked the Dean his opinion." Carrington continued, and the Dean opened his eyes to peer at his own face as it appeared on the screen.
"It's my opinion that young men come up today with their heads filled with anarchist nonsense,"
the Dean heard himself telling the world.
"He did nothing of the sort," shouted the Dean. "He never mentioned Zipser."
Carrington issued his denial.
"So you see this as an act of self-destructive nihilism on the part of a young man who had been working too hard?"
"Porterhouse has always been a sporting college. In the past we have tried to achieve a balance between scholarship and sport,"
the Dean replied.
"He never put that question to me," yelled the real Dean. "He's taking my words out of context."
"You don't see this as an act of sexual aberration?"
Carrington interrupted.
"Sex Sexual promiscuity plays no part in college life, the Dean asserted.
"You've certainly changed your tune, Dean," shouted the chaplain. "The first time I've heard you say that."
"I didn't say that," screamed the Dean. "I said—" "Hush, hush," said Sir Godber. "I'm trying to hear what you did say." The Dean turned purple in the darkness as Carrington continued.
"I interviewed the chaplain of Porterhouse in the Fellows' Garden," he told the world.
The Dean had disappeared, to be replaced by the rockeries and elms and two tiny figures walking on the lawn. The camera zoomed in on the chaplain.
The college used to have a brothel, you know. People liked to pretend it was a nunnery, but it was actually a whorehouse. In the 15th century, it was quite the normal thing."
The chaplain's voice echoed across the lawn.
"Burnt down in 1541. Oh, great pity, really." "So, you don't agree with the Dean that—" "Agree with the Dean? Dear me, no. Never did. Peculiar fellow, the Dean. All those photographs of young men in his room. And he's getting on in years now. Well, we all are. We all are."
The camera moved away slowly, leaving the chaplain a distant figure in a landscape with his voice growing fainter, like the distant cawing of rooks. The chaplain turned to the senior tutor.
"Oh, it was rather nice, seeing oneself on the screen like that. Most enlightening."
In the corner, a strangled sound issued from the Dean. The senior tutor was breathing hard too, and staring at the river at Fen Ditton. An 8 was swinging round Grassy Corner, and an aged youth in a blazer and a cap cycled busily after them. As the 8 approached and disappeared, the screen filled with the perspiring face of the senior tutor. He stopped and dismounted his bicycle. Carrington's voice interrupted his panting.
"You've been a coach now for 20 years, and in that time you must have seen some extraordinary changes in Porterhouse. What do you think of the type of young man coming up to Cambridge today?"
"I've seen some lily-livered swine in my time," the senior tutor bawled, "but nothing to equal this. A more disgraceful exhibition of gutlessness I've never seen."
In the combination room, the senior tutor was speechless with rage.
"He didn't ask me any questions like that. He wasn't even there," he managed to gasp. "He told me they were simply going to film me on the river."
As the devastating disclosures continued, the fellows sat dumbfounded in the combination room. Carrington waxed eloquent on Porterhouse's academic shortcomings, interviewed several undergraduates who sat with their backs to the camera to preserve their anonymity, and claimed that they were afraid they would be sent down if their identities were known to the senior members of the college. They accused the college authorities of being hidebound, and on it went. Sir Godber put his case for social compassion as the hallmark of the educated mind, and suddenly the scene changed. The camera switched to Carrington, live.
"In the interviews we have already shown tonight, we have heard a good deal to justify, and some would say to condemn, the role of institutions such as Porterhouse. We have heard the old traditions defended. We have heard privilege attacked by the progressive young, and we have heard a great deal about social compassion. But now we have in the studio a man who more than any other has an intimate knowledge of Porterhouse, and whose knowledge extends over 4 decades. Now you, Mr. Scullion, have been for some 40 years the porter of Porterhouse."
Scullion nodded.
"Yes." "So, really, you've been in the college long enough to have seen some quite remarkable changes."
Scullion nodded obediently.
"And now I understand you've been sacked. Have you any idea why this has happened?"
Scullion paused while the camera moved in for a close-up.
"I have been dismissed because I objected to the installation of a contraceptive dispenser in the college for the use of the young gentlemen,"
Scullion told 3 million viewers.
There was a pause while the camera swung back to Carrington, who was looking shocked and surprised.
A contraceptive dispenser?
Scullion nodded.
A contraceptive dispenser. I don't think it's right and proper for senior members of college like Porterhouse to encourage young men to behave like that.
Oh, my God, said the master. Beside him, the senior tutor was staring at the screen with bulging eyes, while the dean appeared to be in the throes of some appalling paroxysm. Beside him, the bursar whimpered. Carrington, too, seemed to have shrunk to a less substantial role.
You think the attitude of the authorities is wrong?
He asked lamely.
Of course it's wrong. Young people shouldn't be taught to think that they've the right to do what they want. Life isn't like that.
Quite, said Carrington, desperately trying to think of some way of getting the discussion back to the original topic.
And you think?
I think they've lost their nerves. They're frightened. They call it permissiveness. It isn't that. It's cowardice.
Cowardice?
Carrington had begun to dither.
It's a shame all over. Give them degrees when they haven't done any work. Let them walk about looking like unwashed scarecrows. Don't send them down when they take drugs. Let them come in at all hours of the night and have women in their rooms. When I first started as a porter, they'd send an undergrad down soon as look at him, and quite right too. But now they want them to have an FL machine in the gents to keep them happy. And what about me? Scullion asked the camera in front of him. Worked for a pittance for 40 years, and they sacked me for nothing. Is that fair? You want permissiveness? Well, why can't I be permitted to work? I offered them money to keep me on. You asked the bursar if I didn't offer him my savings to help the college out.
Carrington grasped at the straw.
You offered the bursar your life savings to help the college out?
He asked with as much enthusiasm as he could muster.
He said they couldn't afford to keep me on as porter. He said they were having to sell Ryder Street to pay for the repairs to the tower.
And Ryder Street is where you live?
It's where all the college servants live. They've got no right to turn us out of our own homes.
In the combination room, the master and the fellows of Porterhouse watched the reputation of the college disintegrate as Scullion pressed on with his charges. This was no longer Carrington on Cambridge. Scullion had taken over with a truer and more forceful nostalgia. While Carrington sat pale and haggard beside him, Scullion ranged far and wide. He held a mirror up to the mythical past, and in a million homes, men and women responded to the appeal. By the time the programme ended, the switchboard at the BBC was jammed with calls from people all over the country. The fellows sat looking at the blank screen long after Scullion's terrible image had disappeared and the bursar had switched the set off. It was the chaplain who finally broke the appalled silence.
Very interesting point of view, Scullion's. Though I must admit to having some doubts about the effect on the Restoration Fund. What did you think of the programme, Master?
I don't suppose, Sir Godber said with a desperate attempt at composure, that many people will take much note of what a college porter has to say. The public have very short memories. An hour later, exhausted by the programme and by the terrible animosity it had provoked among his colleagues, he finally left the combination room and made his way back to the master's lodge. As he stumbled across the lawn, he was still uncertain what effect the programme would have, tried to recall what it was about his own appearance on the screen that had so alarmed him. For the first time in his life, he had seen himself as others saw him, an old man mouthing clichés with a conviction that was wholly unconvincing. He went into the lodge and shut the door. Scullion sat in the entertainment room of the BBC with a reporter from the Observer, one Elsie Controp. It was past 11, but he was not feeling tired. His TV appearance had invigorated him, and the whisky was helping. "You mean the college authorities accept candidates who have taken no entrance examination and who have no A-levels?" Miss Controp asked. Scullion drank some more whisky and nodded. And their parents subscribe to an endowment fund. Scullion nodded again. Miss Controp's pencil flitted across her pad. And this is quite a normal procedure at Porterhouse. Scullion agreed that it was. But how do they get degrees if they can't pass the exams? Scullion smiled. Oh, they failed the tripos. Then they give them pass degrees. College recommends someone for a pass degree and they get it. It's a fiddle. You can say that again, said Miss Controp fervently. And on the following Sunday, the Observer ran a headline. Cambridge College sells degrees. Porter alleges corruption, complete with a photograph of Scullion and a detailed analysis of Porterhouse's financial affairs. Following Sunday morning service, the Dean and the senior tutor walked down the cloisters with a speculative air.
After that dreadful programme, I would hardly go so far as to say that I missed him, the Dean said, though I dare say he's a great loss to the college.
In more ways than one, said the senior tutor. Apparently there is a not unsubstantial rumour going round that Scullion's assertion that he offered the college his life savings was not without foundation. The Dean waded through the morass of double negatives towards some sort of assertion. Ah, he said finally, uncertain how far to commit himself. I understand that Scullion is worth a good deal more than one might have supposed.
I always said Scullion was invaluable.
The sum mentioned was in the region of £250,000.
Out of the question to what?
£250,000.
Good God!
Lord Wooford's legacy to him.
And the bloody bursar turned it down.
It puts a rather different complexion on the matter, doesn't it?
My God, £250,000 and the master sacked him.
The senior tutor helped him down the cloisters. Come and have a little something in my rooms. They passed the main gate where a youth was holding a placard which was daubed, Reinstate Scullion.
Look at that. For once I think the protesters are right.
The danger is that some other college will bag him before we get the chance.
Do you really think so?
Asked the Dean anxiously.
The dear old fellow is such a loyal college servant.
Even to the Dean's ears the word servant had a hollow ring to it now. Has it occurred to you that it might be possible to turn this affair of Carrington's programme and Scullion's sacking to some advantage?
It's too late for that now. We have been exposed to ridicule. Maybe college policy to suffer fools gladly, but I'm afraid the public has other views about university education.
The senior tutor shook his head. I think you may be unduly pessimistic. We have certain advantages on our side. For one thing, we have Scullion, who made an extremely favourable impression.
At our expense,
the Dean pointed out. Certainly, but the fact remains that public sympathy is on his side. Let us assume for a moment that the college council, all excepting the master, agree to demand Scullion's reinstatement. Sir Godber would naturally resist, and would be seen to resist such a move. We should appear as the champions of the underdog, and the master would find himself in an extremely difficult position. If further we present a reasoned case for our admissions policy...
Impossible!
I haven't finished. There is a sound case to be made for admitting candidates without suitable academic qualifications. We provide a natural outlet for those without apparent ability. No other college performs such a necessary function. Couple a properly articulated public appeal on behalf of the scholastically crippled, with demands on our part for Scullion's reinstatement, and we could well turn what appears to be defeat into victory.
Yes, There may be something in what you say. It has always seemed to me to be decidedly inequitable that only the intelligent minority should be allowed to benefit from a university education.
My point exactly. We cease to be the college of privilege, we become the college of the intellectually deprived. It is simply a question of emphasis. What is more, since we are not dependent on grant-assisted undergraduates, it is self-evident that we are saving public money. The question remains how to present this new image to the public.
The first essential is to call an urgent meeting of the college council and get some degree of unanimity about reinstating Scullion.
The college council met at 10 on Monday morning, and even the master, who was not fully informed of the agenda, welcomed the meeting.
"We must thrash this affair out once and for all,"
he told the bursar as they made their way to the council chamber.
"The allegations in yesterday's Observer have made it essential to make a clean break with the past."
"They've certainly made things very awkward for us," said the bursar.
"They've made it a damn sight more awkward for the old fogies."
The bursar sighed. It was evidently going to be an acrimonious meeting. And it was. The senior tutor led the attack. "I'm proposing that we issue a statement rescinding the dismissal of Scullion," he told the council when the preliminaries had been dealt with.
"Out of the question," snapped the master. "Scullion has chosen to draw the attention of the public to facts about college policy which I am sure we all agree have put the reputation of Porterhouse in jeopardy." "I can't agree," said the dean.
"I certainly don't," said the senior tutor.
"But the whole world knows now that we sell degrees," Sir Godber insisted.
"That portion of the world that happens to read the Observer, perhaps," said the senior tutor. "But in any case, allegations are not facts."
"In this case they happen to be facts. Scullion was speaking no more than the truth."
"In that case, I can't see why you should object to his reinstatement," said the senior tutor. They argued for 20 minutes, but the master remained adamant.
"I suggest we put the motion to the vote," said the dean finally.
Sir Godber looked round the table angrily.
"Before we do, I think you should consider some further matters. I have been examining the college statutes over the past few days, and it appears that as master I am empowered, should I so wish, to take over admissions. In the light of your refusal to agree to a change in college policy regarding the sort of candidates we admit, I have decided I shall personally choose all freshmen. It also lies within my power to select college servants and to dismiss those I consider unsatisfactory. I shall do just that. However you may vote in council, I shall not, as master, reinstate Scullion."
In the council chamber, a momentary silence followed the master's announcement. Then the senior tutor spoke.
"This is outrageous. The statutes are out of date. The position of the master is purely a formal one. I admire your consistency. As the upholder of outmoded traditions, you should be the first to congratulate me for reassuming powers that are a legacy of the past."
The senior tutor was on his feet now.
"I find your behaviour quite unwarranted. We, sir, are not some pack of schoolboys that you can dictate to. If you behave like schoolboys, you may expect to be treated like schoolboys."
"Now, if you would be so good as to resume your seat, the meeting may continue."
The master looked icily at the fellows, and the senior tutor sat down. Scullion lay in bed and stared at the pale blue ceiling of his London hotel room. He had had enough. He'd said his piece, and he'd been inside a television studio. That was sufficient, he decided. Now he'd go back to Cambridge. 2 hours later he was sitting in the train smoking his pipe and looking out at the flat fields of Essex. The monotony of the landscape pleased him and reminded him of the fens. He could buy a bit of land in the fens now if he wanted to and grow vegetables. Scullion considered the idea only to reject it. He didn't want a new life. He wanted his old one back. When the train stopped at Cambridge, Scullion had made up his mind. He would make one last appeal, and this time he'd speak to the master himself. He walked out of the station, wondering why he hadn't thought of it before. After all, the master could only turn him down. Scullion considered the prospect and decided it was worth trying, even if it meant risking his self-respect. But was he risking it? All he was asking for was his rights. And besides, he had £250,000 to his name. He didn't need the job. It was simply that he wanted it. Wanted his good name back. Wanted to go on doing what he'd always done for 45 years. Wanted to be the porter of Porterhouse. Buoyed by the good sense of his own argument, Scullion turned towards the college determinedly. Sir Godber sat in his study reading a book. Outside, the winter sky darkened. At 5 he got up and pulled the curtains, and he was about to sit down again when a knock at the front door made him stop and go down the corridor into the hall. He opened the door and peered out into the darkness. A familiar shape stood on the doorstep. "Scullion," said Sir Godber, as if questioning the existence of the shape. "What are you doing here?" To Scullion the question emphasized his misery. "I'd like a word." Sir Godber hesitated. He didn't want words with Scullion. "What about?" It was Scullion's turn to hesitate. "I've come to apologize." "Apologize? What for?" Scullion shook his head. He didn't know what for. "Well, man?" "It's just that—" "Oh, for goodness sake," said Sir Godber, appalled at Scullion's inarticulate despair. "Come on in." He turned and led the way to his study, with Scullion treading gently behind him. "Well, now, what is it?" he asked when they were in the room. "It's about my dismissal, sir." "Your dismissal?" Sir Godber sighed. He was a sympathetic man who had to steel himself with irritation. "You should see the bursar about that." "I've seen the bursar." "I don't see that I can do anything." "I've given my life to the college," interrupted Scullion. "I dare say." Scullion glowered at the master. "All I ask is to be kept on." The master turned his back on him and kicked the fire with his foot. The man's maudlin appeal annoyed him. Scullion had exercised a baleful influence on the college ever since he could remember. He stood for everything Sir Godber detested. Now, here he was, cap in hand, asking to be taken back. Worst of all, he made the master feel guilty. "I understand from the bursar that you have financial means," he said callously. "Yes." "Well then, I really can't see what you're complaining about. A lot of people retire at 60. Haven't you got a family?" Scullion shook his head. Again Sir Godber felt a tremor of unreasonable disgust. His contempt showed in his face, contempt as much for his own vulnerable sensibilities as for the pathetic man before him. Scullion saw that contempt, and his little eyes darkened. He hadn't come to be insulted, even silently, by the likes of Sir Godber. Without knowing what he was doing, he took a step forward. Instinctively, Sir Godber recoiled. He was afraid of Scullion, and like his contempt a moment before, it showed. "Now look here," he said with an attempt at authority, but Scullion was looking. His bitter eyes stared at Sir Godber, and he too was in the grip of the past and its violent instincts. His face was flushed, and unknown to him, his fists were clenched. "You bloody bastard!" he shouted, and lunged at the master. Sir Godber staggered backwards and tripped against the coffee table, lurched against the mantelpiece, and the next moment he had fallen back into the fireplace. Beneath his feet, a rug gently slid away, and Sir Godber subsided onto the sturdy floor. His head had hit the corner of the iron grate. Above him Scullion stood dumbfounded. Blood oozed onto the parquet. He stared down at the master for a moment, and turned and ran. He ran down the passage and out of the front door into the street. It was empty. Scullion turned to the right and hurried along the pavement. A moment later he was in Trinity Street. People passed him, but there was nothing unusual about a college porter in a hurry. In the master's lodge, Sir Godber lay still in the flickering light of his fire. The blood running fast from his scalp formed in a pool and dried. An hour passed, and Sir Godber still bled, though more slowly. It was 8 before he recovered consciousness. The room was blurred and distant, and clocks ticked noisily. He tried to get to his feet, but couldn't. He knelt against the fireplace and reached for the armchair. He had to get help somehow. His eye caught the trays of drinks near the door. Whiskey. He crawled towards it and managed to get the bottle. He drank some, and still clutching the bottle, reached the side door. Somehow he opened it and dragged himself out into the Fellows' garden. If only he could reach the court, perhaps he could call out and someone would hear him. He drank some more whiskey and tried to get to his feet. There was a light on in the combination room. Sir Godber raised himself on his knees and fell sideways onto the path. "The whole country is going to the dogs," said the senior tutor as he and the dean crossed New Court. As if in answer, there was a low moan from the Fellows' garden. "What on earth was that?" said the dean. They turned and peered into the darkness. Under the elms, a shadow, darker than the rest, struggled to its feet and collapsed. They crossed the lawn cautiously and stood staring down at the figure on the ground. "Oh, drunk. I'll fetch the porter." But the dean had already struck a match. In the small flare of light, they looked down into the ashen face of Sir Godber. "Good God! It's the master!" They carried him slowly and with difficulty to the master's lodge and laid him down on the sofa. While they waited for the ambulance, the dean sat staring down into the master's face. It was evident Sir Godber was dying. He struggled to speak, but the words wouldn't come. "He's trying to tell us something," said the senior tutor softly. "He must have been drunk," said the dean, who could smell the whiskey on Sir Godber's feeble breath. The master shook his head. An indefinite future awaited him now in which he would only be a memory. It must not be sullied by false report. "Not drunk," he managed to mutter, gazing pitifully into the dean's face. "Scullion." The dean and the senior tutor looked at one another. "What about Scullion?" the senior tutor asked, but the master had no answer for him. They waited for the ambulance before leaving. On the way back through the Fellows' garden, the dean retrieved the whiskey bottle.
I don't think we need mention this to the police. He was obviously drunk and fell into the fireplace. Tragic end."
The senior tutor was lost in thought. "You realize what he's done?"
"Yes, only too well. You shall have to elect a new master."
The senior tutor shook his head. "There can be no question of an election, Dean. The master has nominated his own successor." In the darkness, the two old men stared at one another, digesting the extraordinary import of Sir Godber's last word. It was unthinkable. But yet... "There are precedents," said the senior tutor. "Dr. Cox began his career as a barber. He owed his election to his wealth."
I take your point. In the present circumstances, it is one that cannot be ignored."
"There's also the question of public opinion to consider. In the present climate, it would not be an unpopular appointment. It would disarm our critics entirely."
"So it would. It would indeed. But the college council—"
"Have no say in the matter." Tradition has it that the master's dying words constitute an unalterable decision,
if uttered in the presence of 2 or more of the senior fellows,
agreed the Dean.
So it is up to us.
There is little doubt that he would be malleable. The Dean nodded.
I confess to finding the argument unanswerable.
They rose and snuffed the candles. It was a cold night, but Scullion was unconscious of the cold. His tremors had other causes. He had threatened the master. He had, in all probability, killed him. He sat there at his kitchen table shivering with fright. He couldn't begin to think what to do. The law would find him. Scullion's innate respect for authority rejected the possibility that his crime would go undetected. It was almost as monstrous a thought as the knowledge that he was a murderer. He was still there when the Dean and the senior tutor knocked on his door at 8 o'clock. Scullion listened to the knocking for some minutes before his instincts as a porter got the better of him. He got up and went down the dingy hall and opened the door.
If we could just have a word with you, Mr. Scullion,
the Dean said. To Scullion, the addition of the title had the effect of confirming his worst fears. It suggested the polite formalities of the hangman. He turned and led the way into his front parlour.
I think it would be better if you sat down. What we are about to tell you may come as something of a shock.
Scullion sat down obediently. Nothing that they could tell him would come as a shock, he felt sure. He had prepared himself for the worst.
We have come here this morning to tell you that the master has died.
Scullion's face remained impassively suffused. To the fellows, his evident self-control augured well for the future.
On his deathbed, Sir Godber named you as his successor.
Scullion heard the words, but his expectations deprived them of their meaning. He stared uncomprehendingly at the Dean.
He nominated you as the new master of Porterhouse. We have come here on behalf of the college council to ask you to accept this nomination.
He paused to allow the porter to consider the proposal. In the silence that followed this announcement, Scullion underwent a terrible change. A tremor ran down his body, and his face, already purple, became darker still. He wrestled with the terrible inconsequentiality of it all. He had murdered the master, and they were offering him the mastership. There were no just rewards in life, only insane inversions of the scheme of things in which he had trusted. It seemed for a moment that he was going mad.
We must have your answer.
Scullion's body acted uncontrollably as he went into apoplexy. His head nodded frantically.
Then we may take it that you accept.
Scullion's head nodded without stop.
The poor fellow was quite overcome,
said the Dean as they climbed back into the car.
It seemed to leave him speechless.
At least we shan't have any speeches at the feast, said the senior tutor.
I suppose there is that to be said for it, said the Dean.
In the front parlour of his old home, the new master of Porterhouse lay still in his chair and stared calmly at the linoleum. A new peace had come to Scullion out of the chaos of the last few minutes. There were no contradictions now, between right and wrong, master and servant, only a strange inability to move his left side. Scullion had suffered a Porterhouse blue. In the master's lodge, Scullion's life followed its inexorable pattern. He was wheeled from room to room to catch the sun, so that it was possible to tell the time of day from his position at the windows, and every afternoon Arthur would take him out through the Fellows' Garden and across New Court to the main gate. On Thursday nights the master dined in hall, wheeled in by Arthur at the head of the fellows, to sit at the end of the table and watch the ancient ritual of grace and the serving of the dishes with a critical eye. While the fellows gorged themselves, Scullion was fed a few choice morsels by Arthur. It was his worst humiliation, that and the fact that his shoes lacked the brilliance that his patient spit and polish had once given them. It was left to the Dean, unfeeling to the end, to say the last words in the combination room after one such meal.
He may not have been born with a silver spoon in his mouth, but by God, he's going to die with one.
In his corner by the fire, the master was seen to twitch deferentially at this joke at his own expense. But then, Scullion had always known his place.